In the heart of the Ganges Plain, more than 2,300 years ago, a dynasty rose to power that would forever change the political landscape of ancient India. The Nandas of Magadha, often remembered as wealthy, ambitious, and controversial, built one of the earliest true empires of the subcontinent. Yet today, they stand partly in shadow, caught between the fading light of early kingdoms and the brilliance of the Mauryan age that followed. Who were these rulers who commanded vast armies and enormous treasuries? How did a family of uncertain origins manage to dominate nearly all of northern India? And why did their reign, for all its power, end so abruptly? This is the story of the Nanda Empire. Long before the Nandas emerged as rulers of a powerful empire, the region of Magadha had already begun shaping itself into a center of wealth, innovation, and political ambition. In the centuries leading up to the Nanda period, Magadha evolved from one among many small states into the most dominant kingdom of northern India. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It was the result of generations of rulers, shifting alliances, wars, and economic advantages that steadily expanded Magadha's influence. To understand the Nanda Empire, we must first understand the world that produced it. A world of competing Mahajanapadas, large republics and monarchies that occupied the plains of northern India during the later Vedic and early historical periods. Among the 16 great Mahajanapadas mentioned in ancient Buddhist and Jain sources, 4 in particular, Kosala, Vatsa, Avanti, and Magadha, became the chief contenders for power. Each possessed fertile land, prosperous cities, and strategic locations. Yet, it was Magadha, located in what is today southern Bihar, that ultimately outpaced the rest. Magadha's advantages were both natural and human. The region lay along the middle reaches of the Ganges River, surrounded by fertile alluvial plains ideal for agriculture. Its soil yielded grain in abundance, feeding a dense population and supporting growing towns. The rivers, the Ganges, Sun, and Champa, served as vital arteries for transport and trade. Forests on the nearby Chota Nagpur plateau provided timber and elephants, both essential for warfare. Iron ore deposits in the hills of present-day Bihar and Jharkhand gave Magadha a steady supply of weapons and tools. Geography, in short, gave Magadha the means to feed armies, equip them, and move them efficiently. But geography alone does not build an empire. Leadership, organization, and vision matter just as much. In the 6th century BCE, under the Haryanka dynasty, Magadha began to emerge as a force to be reckoned with. One of its early and most influential rulers was Bimbisara, who reigned around the middle of that century. Bimbisara inherited a modest kingdom but transformed it into a formidable state through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and administrative reforms. Bimbisara's approach was pragmatic. He strengthened Magadha not only through conquest, but also through alliances. By marrying the princesses of neighboring realms, such as Kosala and Lichchavi, he turned potential rivals into allies. These marital ties provided stability on Magadha's borders, freeing Bimbisara to expand elsewhere. He also reorganized administration, appointing officials to oversee trade, agriculture, and justice, which allowed him to collect taxes more efficiently and maintain a regular army. Under Bimbisara, Magadha's capital, Rajagriha, modern Rajgir, became a thriving political and cultural center. Buddhist and Jain texts describe it as a bustling city surrounded by stone walls, filled with merchants, monks, and travelers. The king himself is said to have interacted with spiritual teachers like the Buddha and Mahavira, reflecting how Magadha was not only politically dynamic but also intellectually vibrant. Bimbisara's reign set the foundation for Magadha's rise, but the next phase came under his son Ajatashatru, whose rule was marked by both ambition and turmoil. Ajatashatru seized the throne after imprisoning his father, an act that ancient sources remembered with both shock and fascination. His reign, roughly from the late 6th to the early 5th century BCE, was a time of military expansion and state-building. Ajatashatru recognized that to secure Magadha's dominance, he needed to control the Ganges plain, He launched wars against Kosala, Vatsa, and particularly the Lichchavis of Vaishali, who led a powerful republican confederation north of the Ganges. The war against the Lichchavis was long and difficult, but Ajatashatru's persistence and technological innovation made the difference. Buddhist texts credit him with the use of new siege engines and fortified war towers mounted on chariots. Whether or not these details are fully accurate, they suggest a ruler who invested heavily in military strategy and innovation. By the time of Ajatashatru's death, Magadha had become the preeminent power in the Gangetic region. The control of key trade routes and river crossings enriched its treasury. Its rivals were weakened or subdued. The consolidation of power at Rajagriha had begun transforming Magadha into something more than a regional kingdom. It was becoming the nucleus of an empire. The generations that followed saw political instability but continued expansion. The Haryanka dynasty eventually gave way to the Shishunagas, who shifted the capital from Rajagriha to Pataliputra, a move that would prove historically decisive. Situated at the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers, Pataliputra, modern Patna, occupied one of the most strategic positions in northern India. The city could control river traffic from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, serving as a hub for trade, communication, and defense. According to Buddhist chronicles, King Shishunaga began his career as a provincial governor before ascending to the throne, suggesting a degree of social mobility and perhaps even a revolt against corrupt elites. His reign brought temporary unity after a period of unrest, and Magadha continued to extend its influence westward into Avanti, absorbing it into the growing Magadhan realm. The move to Pataliputra was more than symbolic. It reflected a new stage in the evolution of Magadhan statecraft, one that relied on centralized administration, a professional army, and an increasingly complex economy. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the 5th century BCE, the lower Ganges Valley was seeing the rise of larger urban centers, coinage systems, and long-distance trade networks. Magadha, sitting at the heart of these networks, became the main beneficiary. The Shishunaga period also witnessed the gradual decline of rival powers. Kosala's influence waned after prolonged wars with Magadha, while the republics of the north struggled to maintain cohesion against monarchic aggression. By the 4th century BCE, Magadha stood virtually unchallenged in the eastern Gangetic plain. Its rulers had learned the lessons of consolidation and control, lessons that would be perfected by the Nandas. Religious and cultural life during this era further reinforced Magadha's prominence. The region had become the center of two major intellectual movements, Buddhism and Jainism. Both arose in the wider Gangetic world, but found strong patronage in Magadha. The open exchange of ideas, the questioning of traditional hierarchies, and the emphasis on ethical governance resonated with rulers and subjects alike. This spiritual climate helped shape the administrative ideals that later dynasties would claim to uphold: justice, order, and moral kingship. Economically, the 5th and 4th centuries BCE were transformative. The widespread use of iron tools allowed more land to be cleared for cultivation, boosting agricultural output. The resulting surplus supported craft industries and urban growth. Punch-marked silver coins found across northern India point to an expanding market economy and sophisticated trade systems. Magadha's rulers could now collect taxes not only in kind, but also in coin, giving them the flexibility to maintain large standing armies. Yet with power came new challenges. The very success of Magadha's kings attracted court rivalries and social tensions. The question of legitimacy, who had the right to rule, was never far from the surface. Dynastic transitions often involved intrigue, and the growing influence of bureaucrats and generals began to compete with royal authority. The Shishunagas managed to hold the kingdom together, but by the time of their later successors, cracks had begun to show. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Magadha had already stood at the center of northern India's political world for generations. The capital at Pataliputra, with its fortified walls and riverine position, symbolized the growing permanence of centralized rule. The Shishunaga dynasty, which had overseen this rise, had extended Magadha's authority farther than ever before. Yet beneath the surface of stability, old loyalties were fracturing. Administrative reforms and new economic power had created ambitious officials, generals, and provincial governors who no longer saw themselves as mere servants of the throne. Out of this environment emerged Mahapadma Nanda, the man who would end the Shishunaga line and inaugurate a new phase in Indian political history. The exact circumstances of Mahapadma's rise are partly shrouded in legend, but the outlines of his story are clear. Ancient sources, Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical, agree that the transition from the Shishunagas to the Nandas was not a peaceful inheritance but a dramatic seizure of power. The later Puranas describe Mahapadma as the destroyer of the Kshatriyas, the traditional warrior class, suggesting both his military strength and his challenge to established hierarchies. The Buddhist Mahavamsa and the Jain Parashishtaparvan remember him as a monarch who expanded Magadha's borders and ruled with immense wealth, while Brahmanical texts, perhaps written from the viewpoint of displaced elites, portray him as a ruler of low origin who overturned the old social order. However, one interprets these accounts, they point to a moment of revolutionary change. The Shishunaga dynasty had been a conventional monarchy supported by established elites. Mahapadma's seizure of power broke that continuity. He did not simply claim the throne as a rightful heir, he created a new royal identity, one rooted in state power and wealth rather than lineage. To grasp how such a political break could happen, it helps to look at the broader context of the 4th century BCE. By this time, Magadha's expansion under earlier dynasties had produced a vast and complex territory. Governing it required delegation. Provincial governors and military officers held real power in the outer regions. As wealth flowed toward the capital, competition for influence within the court intensified. Succession disputes were common, and rival factions maneuvered to place their candidates on the throne. When a ruler grew weak or unpopular, the loyalty of provincial commanders could waver. The Shishunaga dynasty, though successful in consolidating power, may have struggled to maintain firm control over this widening network of authority. The very systems that had made Magadha strong, its organized bureaucracy and large standing army, could be turned against a weakened monarch. Somewhere within this administrative structure, Mahapadma Nanda found his opportunity. According to later traditions, Mahapadma's father may have been a Shishunaga king, and his mother a woman of humble birth, perhaps from a merchant or lower caste family. Whether or not this is literally true, the story captures a deeper reality. Mahapadma's ascent represented the widening of royal power beyond hereditary elites. In a world where trade, money, and military skill were becoming more important than noble descent, a man of talent and ambition could rise rapidly. The transfer of power likely came through a combination of internal intrigue and military force. Pataliputra's garrison, loyal to the person who controlled the treasury, played a decisive role. The sources hint that Mahapadma commanded not only wealth, but also the confidence of the army. Once he secured the capital, the remaining Shishunaga supporters were swept aside. The dynasty that had ruled Magadha for several generations came to an abrupt end, and a new royal house stood in its place. Mahapadma's first challenge as ruler was legitimacy. Dynastic succession in ancient India was normally justified through divine lineage, ritual inheritance, and the continuity of sacred kingship. Mahapadma lacked these traditional supports. He could not claim descent from the ancient solar or lunar dynasties revered in Brahmanical lore. Instead, he turned to another source of authority: conquest. The Puranas call him Ekarat, meaning the sole ruler, a title that reflected both ambition and ideology. Mahapadma presented himself as the restorer of order, a king chosen by destiny to unify the land under one rule. His campaigns against rival powers were framed not as mere wars of aggression, but as acts of purification, sweeping away corrupt or divided kingdoms to establish a single, stable realm. In practical terms, Mahapadma began by consolidating control over the core provinces of Magadha. The capital's bureaucracy was restructured, and key administrative posts were filled with loyal officials rather than hereditary nobles. He strengthened the treasury, standardized revenue collection, and built direct royal authority over land and taxation. For the first time in Indian history, the ruler of Magadha controlled a fiscal system capable of sustaining an empire on a continental scale. The scale of Mahapadma's wealth became legendary. Later, Greek writers, hearing accounts from travelers and merchants, spoke of a king of India who commanded a standing army numbering in the hundreds of thousands and possessed unimaginable treasures. While such figures are certainly exaggerated, they reflect a real perception that the Nanda state had amassed resources unlike any before it. Control of the fertile Gangetic plains, the river trade, and the emerging monetized economy gave Mahapadma an income unmatched by his predecessors. This new economic strength had political consequences. In earlier centuries, a king's power had rested on alliances with the nobility and the support of landholding elites. Mahapadma, by contrast, could finance his rule directly through taxation and trade revenues. His dependence on old aristocratic families diminished, and his ability to hire professional soldiers and officials increased. This shift toward a state-funded military marked a turning point in Indian political development. It made loyalty to the ruler, not to the lineage, the basis of service. Mahapadma's authority also extended through ideological means. Court poets and chroniclers fashioned him as a universal monarch, a figure destined to bring unity to the subcontinent. This was not mere vanity, it was political messaging aimed at legitimizing a new dynasty. By claiming to be the destroyer of Kshatriyas, Mahapadma projected the image of a ruler who had overcome the limitations of caste politics and factionalism. He positioned himself above the traditional order, presenting his kingship as the guarantor of stability in a fragmented world. Yet even as he challenged the old social hierarchies, Mahapadma understood the value of continuity. He maintained the administrative framework developed under earlier rulers, keeping the same capital, the same provincial divisions, and much of the same bureaucratic machinery. His innovation lay not in dismantling the system, but in tightening royal control over it. Magadha under Mahapadma became more centralized than ever before. Provincial governors were closely monitored, revenues were meticulously recorded, and an elaborate spy network, known later under the Mauryas, likely had its beginnings during this period. The purpose was clear: to prevent the emergence of rivals and ensure that the flow of taxes and goods reached Pataliputra without interference. The consolidation of power was accompanied by military expansion. Although detailed records of Mahapadma's campaigns are scarce, later sources credit him with the subjugation of several powerful kingdoms across northern India. These included Kuru, Panchala, Kashi, and others, once counted among the ancient Mahajanapadas. Whether these conquests were direct annexations or assertions of suzerainty, they signaled Magadha's transformation into a true imperial power. Each conquest served multiple purposes. Militarily, it secured the frontiers. Economically, it integrated new sources of tribute and trade. Politically, it reinforced Mahapadma's claim to be the sole ruler. The cumulative effect was the creation of an empire that stretched from the eastern plains toward the western heartlands, a scale of power unmatched in India up to that time. Mahapadma's rule also marked the beginning of a new relationship between the king and his subjects. The massive fiscal apparatus required to sustain the army and bureaucracy imposed heavier taxation on farmers, artisans, and merchants. While the system enriched the state, it also introduced tension between rulers and ruled. Later traditions remembered the Nandas as immensely wealthy but unpopular, a reflection of how administrative success could coexist with social resentment. Still, in the context of the 4th century BCE, Mahapadma's achievements were extraordinary. He took a regional kingdom and transformed it into an imperial structure, economically stable, militarily powerful, and administratively centralized. His reign demonstrated that effective rule did not depend solely on noble birth, but on the ability to command resources and maintain order. The impact of this political shift went beyond Magadha. Neighboring states had to adjust to a new reality. The rise of a strong, unified Magadha altered the balance of power across northern India. Some kingdoms, unable to resist militarily, accepted tributary status. Others tried to strengthen their own defenses or seek alliances. But none could ignore the emergence of a state whose influence radiated across the subcontinent. Mahapadma's legacy also lay in what he set in motion. By consolidating Magadha's resources and building the machinery of empire, he provided the structural foundation upon which his successors, and later the Mauryas, would build. The bureaucracy, the fiscal system, the professional army, and even the ideology of universal kingship all took shape under his rule. When Mahapadma Nanda secured the throne of Magadha, his first great task was not expansion, but control. To hold the empire he had taken, he needed to transform power seized through force into a stable, lasting authority. The seizure of a throne is an act of ambition. Its consolidation is an act of statecraft. In this, Mahapadma revealed his true genius, not only as a conqueror, but as a builder of systems. His rule at Pataliputra set in motion the administrative and political reforms that would make the Nanda Empire one of the strongest and most organized states of ancient India. The city of Pataliputra, already a thriving center under the Shishunagas, now became the unmistakable heart of an empire. Its location at the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers made it an ideal capital. From there, Mahapadma could send orders both east and west, controlling trade routes that connected the interior to the coast. The rivers themselves were natural highways, allowing goods, officials, and troops to move quickly across the plains. Control of Pataliputra meant control of communication and commerce, the veins through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. The first step in consolidating rule was securing loyalty within the capital. The coup that had brought Mahapadma to power had likely disrupted court networks and alarmed the city's elites. He could not rely on hereditary nobles, many of whom resented the rise of a man from outside their ranks. To stabilize his rule, Mahapadma restructured the royal court and replaced old aristocratic offices with a new class of administrators drawn from outside the traditional nobility, men selected for skill, loyalty, and administrative ability rather than birth. This was a profound change in the nature of Indian monarchy. Earlier kings, even powerful ones like Bimbisara and Ajatashatru, still governed through a network of clan and family ties, depending on local chiefs and aristocrats to manage provincial affairs. Mahapadma, by contrast, emphasized direct royal control. His officials were salaried servants of the crown, bound by financial reward and discipline, not by lineage. In effect, he created a professional bureaucracy, a structure that would endure under his successors and later reach its full form under the Mauryas. To sustain this bureaucracy, Mahapadma strengthened the fiscal system. He ordered detailed surveys of agricultural land, established fixed rates of taxation, and tightened royal control over resource-producing regions such as mines, forests, and river ports. The revenues collected from land taxes, trade duties, and resource management flowed directly into the royal treasury at Pataliputra. This treasury, according to later traditions, became immense, earning the Nandas a reputation as the richest rulers in Indian history up to that time. The increased wealth served several purposes. It financed a vast standing army, crucial for deterring rebellion, and supported the maintenance of roads, fortifications, and irrigation systems. It also enabled Mahapadma to reward loyalty generously. By distributing wealth strategically, he turned potential rivals into dependents. The army itself was both a symbol and a tool of consolidation. Though later Greek accounts, such as those of Megasthenes and Curtius Rufus, probably exaggerated its size, they nevertheless captured an important truth. The Nandas commanded a military apparatus of unprecedented scale. Infantry, cavalry, chariots, and war elephants were organized into permanent units, equipped and paid by the state. This was no longer a temporary levy raised for seasonal campaigns, as had been common in earlier centuries. It was a professional institution, bound directly to the throne. Such an army required not only funding but administration. Mahapadma's government maintained records of troop numbers, supplies, and logistics, an early form of military bureaucracy. Garrisons were stationed at key points across the empire, often near river crossings or trade routes, ensuring both security and quick mobilization. The presence of these troops projected royal authority into the provinces and discouraged rebellion. But Mahapadma's consolidation was not achieved through force alone. He understood that to rule a diverse and growing empire, he needed legitimacy as well as power. His seizure of the throne had broken dynastic continuity, and his background may have alienated sections of the Brahmanical elite. To counter this, he invested in public works and state rituals that emphasized prosperity, order, and justice. Temples and shrines received royal patronage, and large-scale building projects enhanced the prestige of Pataliputra as an imperial city. One of the most important features of Nanda consolidation was the integration of the empire's provinces into a single administrative network. Magadha's territory now stretched across multiple linguistic and cultural zones, from the Gangetic Plains to parts of central India. Mahapadma divided these lands into provinces, each overseen by a governor or military commander directly accountable to the crown. Regular communication between the center and the provinces was maintained through couriers and river transport. These governors were tasked with collecting revenue, maintaining law and order, and ensuring the steady flow of goods to the capital. They were also responsible for intelligence gathering, keeping the king informed of local developments. This emphasis on surveillance and reporting would later become a hallmark of the Mauryan administration, suggesting that its roots lay in Nanda practice. The economy of Magadha flourished under this centralized control. The fertile plains yielded abundant crops, and the state's supervision of agriculture ensured stable supplies. The Nanda administration is believed to have supported irrigation projects, particularly along the Ganges basin, to sustain intensive farming. In urban centers like Pataliputra, Champa, and Rajagriha, craftsmen and merchants thrived under the protection of royal authority. Trade expanded both internally and externally. River routes connected Magadha with distant regions, northwest toward Gandhara, eastward toward Bengal, and southward into the Deccan. The state's role in regulating and taxing trade provided both revenue and stability. The use of punch-marked silver coins became widespread, symbolizing a monetized economy that facilitated commerce and taxation alike. This flourishing economy strengthened Mahapadma's political base. A well-fed, prosperous population could be taxed efficiently and was less likely to rebel. Merchants benefited from the protection of the state, and in turn, their taxes and trade supported the military. In this interdependent system, wealth and authority reinforced each other. Culturally, the consolidation of Magadha under the Nandas coincided with important intellectual and religious developments. The 4th century BCE was an age of philosophical ferment. The teachings of the Buddha and Mahavira continued to spread, while Vedic traditions adapted to the realities of urban life and state power. Pataliputra, with its diverse population and thriving economy, became a meeting ground for these ideas. Though specific evidence of Mahapadma's religious policy is limited, it is likely that he maintained a pragmatic tolerance. His priority was political stability, not religious orthodoxy. The Nanda kings were remembered by later sources as pragmatic rather than devout, a reflection of their focus on administration and wealth over ritual piety. Yet, their patronage of public works and the maintenance of social order echoed the moral ideals of righteous kingship found in both Buddhist and Brahmanical thought. The consolidation of power also brought social changes. The growth of bureaucracy and trade created new avenues of mobility for non-aristocratic groups. Officials, accountants, and merchants gained prominence, while the traditional dominance of hereditary nobles declined. This shift may explain the resentment recorded in later Brahmanical texts, which accused the Nandas of disrespecting caste boundaries. For Mahapadma, however, the inclusion of talented administrators from diverse backgrounds was not ideological, it was practical governance. Despite these successes, the process of consolidation was not without tension. Heavy taxation, while necessary to maintain the army and bureaucracy, burdened rural populations. The centralization of authority limited local autonomy, and some regional elites may have viewed the Nanda rule as overbearing. Yet, Mahapadma's control over the machinery of state was so effective that open revolts were rare. The transformation of Pataliputra under the Nandas was striking. The city expanded in size and complexity, becoming one of the greatest urban centers of its age. Its wooden palisades, wide streets, and orderly layout impressed later Greek observers. The palace complex, according to accounts passed down to later generations, was adorned with impressive halls and gardens. It was both a symbol of royal grandeur and a center of administration, the nerve center of an empire governed by record-keepers, accountants, and military officials. In many ways, the Nanda state represented the culmination of centuries of political evolution in the Gangetic plains. The early kings of Magadha had laid the groundwork, but it was Mahapadma who turned it into a functioning empire. His administrative reforms gave the state coherence, his fiscal system gave it strength, and his control of Pataliputra gave it permanence. Under his watch, the machinery of empire ran with precision. Orders issued from the capital were enforced hundreds of miles away. The collection of revenue became predictable, the deployment of troops systematic, and the authority of the king unquestioned. The model of governance established in this period would outlast the Nandas themselves, forming the institutional framework inherited by the Mauryas. When Mahapadma Nanda had firmly secured his rule over Magadha and transformed Pataliputra into a strong and organized center of administration, his attention turned outward. The empire he had built was stable and wealthy, but to sustain its momentum, it needed to grow. Expansion was both a political necessity and a statement of legitimacy. For a ruler who had risen without noble lineage, conquest was the surest path to proving his divine right to rule. The title of Ekarat, the sole ruler, was not an empty boast. Mahapadma set out to make it a political reality across the subcontinent. The stage for expansion had already been prepared. The previous dynasties of Magadha, the Haryankas and the Shishunagas, had subdued many nearby territories and weakened their rivals. What Mahapadma inherited was not a fragmented landscape, but a political environment full of smaller, vulnerable states, many of which had lost cohesion after decades of warfare and internal strife. Across the Ganges Valley and beyond, old republics were collapsing, aristocratic houses were feuding, and mercenary forces were becoming the new arbiters of power. Mahapadma's early campaigns likely focused on consolidating control over the central Gangetic plains. From his capital at Pataliputra, armies moved westward and northward, bringing under Magadhan authority the fertile regions of Kashi, Kosala, and the remaining territories of the once powerful Vatsa kingdom. Each of these lands had its own history of greatness, but by the 4th century BCE, their political vitality had waned. Magadha's wealth, its standing army, and its centralized command structure gave Mahapadma an overwhelming advantage. Ancient sources, though sparse in detail, suggest that Mahapadma's campaigns were swift and decisive. The Puranas list a remarkable array of kingdoms subdued under his rule: Kuru, Panchala, Kashi, Hyhaya, Kalinga, Asmaka, Avanti, and others. Whether these were direct conquests or the establishment of suzerainty through tribute and treaties is uncertain. But the cumulative effect was clear. Magadha emerged as the first great hegemonic power of northern India. The motivations for these campaigns were not purely territorial. Control over these regions meant access to vital economic and strategic resources. Kashi was renowned for its crafts and religious sanctity. Kosala provided fertile lands and trade routes linking the plains to the Himalayan foothills. Avanti opened gateways to western India and the rich commerce of the Deccan. Each conquest extended the Nanda reach not only in terms of geography, but also in terms of revenue, manpower, and prestige. Mahapadma's strategy combined military might with administrative foresight. Unlike earlier conquerors who often plundered and retreated, he sought to integrate conquered regions into the Magadhan system. Governors loyal to the crown were appointed, taxes were standardized, and local elites were compelled to acknowledge Pataliputra's supremacy. This approach transformed temporary victories into durable control. The provinces thus incorporated became contributors to the Nanda treasury and recruits for its army. One of Mahapadma's most significant campaigns was directed toward Kalinga, on the eastern coast. Kalinga was known for its maritime trade, exporting goods across the Bay of Bengal to distant lands in Southeast Asia. Control of this region would have given Magadha a foothold on the coast and access to international commerce. The conquest of Kalinga, remembered in later traditions, was both a strategic and an economic triumph. It expanded the Nanda sphere beyond the river valleys into the coastal plains, symbolizing the transition from a land-based kingdom to an empire with broader horizons. The logistical demands of these campaigns reveal much about the sophistication of the Nanda administration. Moving large armies across hundreds of miles required organized supply chains, stockpiles of food and weapons, and an effective communication system. Roads and river routes were maintained and guarded, ensuring that reinforcements and provisions reached the front. The efficient use of elephants and horses, along with well-trained infantry, gave the Nanda forces both strength and mobility. Elephants, in particular, were central to Nanda warfare. The forests of Magadha and its surrounding regions were rich in elephants, and Mahapadma's generals made full use of them in battle. These animals were not only weapons of war, but also symbols of royal power. Their presence on the battlefield could break enemy lines and terrify opposing forces. The image of a king commanding hundreds of war elephants reinforced the aura of invincibility that surrounded the Nandas. The expansion of Magadha also had profound political consequences for the rest of India. The smaller Mahajanapadas that had once shared the stage with Magadha now faded into subordination or obscurity. The old republican confederations of the north, such as the Lichavis and Mallas, had already weakened under the Haryankas and Shishunagas. Under Mahapadma, they were absorbed completely, their assemblies dissolved or subordinated to imperial officials. The age of independent republics was drawing to a close, replaced by the era of centralized monarchy. This process of integration reshaped the political map of the subcontinent. For the first time, much of northern India recognized a single dominant power. The unity was not absolute. Local rulers continued to exist, and autonomy persisted in distant regions. But the overarching supremacy of Magadha was no longer in doubt. The model of imperial governance that the Nandas pioneered would become the standard for later empires, a core region of direct rule surrounded by a ring of tributary states bound by diplomacy, tribute, and the implicit threat of military force. Economically, the benefits of expansion were immense. New territories brought in land revenue, trade goods, and labor. The fertile lands of Kashi and Kosala enriched the royal treasury with grain and taxes, while the mines and forests of central India supplied metal and timber. The integration of multiple regional economies created a vast internal market under a common political framework. Goods could move more freely, merchants traveled with greater security, and the use of coinage spread more widely. This growing economic interdependence strengthened the Nanda state. The flow of wealth into Pataliputra enabled continued investment in public works, fortifications, and bureaucracy. The empire's stability, in turn, encouraged more trade and production, a self-reinforcing cycle that deepened Magadha's dominance. The Nandas, perhaps more than any previous dynasty, understood that power and prosperity were intertwined. Culturally, the Nanda expansion fostered increased interaction among diverse regions. Scholars, merchants, and artisans traveled under the protection of imperial authority. The circulation of ideas and goods across newly connected territories contributed to the gradual emergence of a more integrated cultural sphere in northern India. While the Nandas were not known as patrons of religion or art in the same way as later dynasties, their empire provided the material and political conditions that allowed intellectual and cultural movements to flourish. The expansion also had symbolic importance. The ancient Indian concept of the Chakravartin, the universal ruler, was more than myth. It was a political ideal that guided kingship. By extending Magadha's power across the land, Mahapadma presented himself as the living embodiment of this ideal. His conquests were not portrayed merely as acts of aggression but as steps toward restoring unity and order to a fragmented world. In this sense, the Nanda Wars were as much ideological as they were territorial. Resistance, when it arose, was met with calculated force. The Nanda military superiority, supported by vast financial resources, ensured that rebellions were swiftly contained. Local rulers who submitted could retain limited autonomy under Nanda supervision. Those who resisted faced confiscation of their lands and the installation of new administrators. The empire's strength lay in its ability to blend coercion with pragmatism. As the Nanda power expanded westward, the empire began to brush against new frontiers. Regions influenced by Western India's trade networks and, indirectly, by the wider Persian world. This exposure to broader currents of exchange and diplomacy may have introduced new administrative and military ideas into the Nanda state. Some historians believe that the later Mauryan emphasis on centralized governance and record-keeping drew inspiration from these early contacts. By the end of Mahapadma's reign, the boundaries of Magadha had stretched farther than ever before. From the eastern coast of Kalinga to the lands of Avanti in the west, from the Himalayan foothills in the north to the fringes of the Deccan in the south, the Nanda influence was acknowledged. Few regions of northern India remained untouched by their reach. Even if some areas retained nominal independence, they operated within a political environment defined by Magadhan power. The sheer scale of these conquests transformed the character of the empire. Managing such a vast realm required further administrative innovation. Provincial governance became more sophisticated, taxation more uniform, and record-keeping more meticulous. The empire's bureaucracy, already strong, grew in both size and complexity. Mahapadma had proven that a centralized state could sustain continuous expansion without collapsing under its own weight. The success of these campaigns elevated the Nanda dynasty's prestige across India. Mahapadma's name became synonymous with power and wealth. The stories of his victories and his immense treasury circulated widely, inspiring both admiration and resentment. Among later rulers, his model of conquest followed by integration became a standard to emulate. Among common people and priests, however, the heavy taxation required to maintain such an empire would later be remembered less fondly. As Mahapadma Nanda's empire spread across northern India, his power became not only a political reality but also an ideological necessity. An empire that stretched from the Ganges Valley to the coasts and highlands needed more than soldiers and wealth to hold it together. It needed meaning. It needed a vision that explained why one ruler could rightfully command so many lands and peoples. This was where the idea of Ekarat, the sole ruler, emerged, shaping the Nanda dynasty's conception of kingship and providing a framework for their unprecedented authority. The notion of a universal monarch had long existed in the Indian imagination, even before the Nandas. Ancient hymns and epics had spoken of the Chakravartin, the ideal ruler whose chariot wheels rolled unhindered across the earth, bringing order to a fragmented world. This ideal combined divine sanction with worldly power. A true king, it was said, was not merely a protector of his realm, but the guardian of cosmic order, or dharma. What Mahapadma did was to take this traditional concept and give it a new political substance. Unlike earlier kings who had claimed noble lineage from the solar or lunar dynasties, Mahapadma could not rely on ancestry to justify his rule. His claim to legitimacy was built on achievement, not descent. Through conquest and control, he positioned himself as the first ruler to unite the known world of northern India under a single throne. In doing so, he redefined what kingship meant. No longer the inherited right of a few noble families, but the result of superior power and administration. The title Ekarat captured this shift perfectly. It declared not only territorial supremacy, but also moral authority. In a land long divided among rival kingdoms and republican confederations, the Nandas presented themselves as the restorers of unity and peace. Their empire was not merely a collection of conquered lands, it was the earthly embodiment of order after generations of chaos. To sustain this ideological claim, Mahapadma and his court turned to ritual and symbolism. Royal ceremonies were designed to project the grandeur of the monarch and the divine favor that supposedly guided his reign. Large-scale sacrifices, such as the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice traditionally performed by rulers asserting universal sovereignty, may have been revived or reinterpreted in this period. Such rituals were not mere religious observances, they were political theater, binding the population to the image of the king as divinely chosen and unchallengeable. The court poets and chroniclers of the time, though their works do not survive directly, must have played an essential role in crafting this image. In later Puranic literature, Mahapadma is described as the destroyer of the Kshatriyas, a phrase that captures both fear and admiration. On one level, it refers to his military triumphs over rival warrior dynasties. On another, it signals a profound social transformation. By elevating a ruler who was not from the traditional aristocracy, the Nanda era redefined what authority meant in ancient India. This ideological transformation had deep consequences for Indian political thought. The idea that power could flow from capability and organization rather than merely from birth would later influence figures like Chandragupta Maurya and his advisor Chanakya. The Mauryan model of kingship, rooted in pragmatic administration and meritocratic service, was foreshadowed by the ideological innovations of Mahapadma Nanda. At Pataliputra, the imperial court became the stage where this new vision of monarchy was displayed. The city itself, with its ordered streets, grand palace, and bustling markets, symbolized the empire's unity and prosperity. Every act of administration, every public work, and every royal proclamation reinforced the image of the king as the axis of the realm, the one around whom all activity revolved. The Nanda court likely maintained an elaborate hierarchy of officials, priests, and ceremonial officers who enacted the rhythms of royal authority. When the king appeared in public, surrounded by soldiers, ministers, and attendants, it was not only a display of wealth, but a performance of sovereignty. The very act of being seen, of riding through Pataliputra's streets or presiding over royal assemblies, was a statement of legitimacy. The ideological framework of the Nandas also extended to their approach to governance. The idea of the Ekarat implied that the ruler's will was synonymous with the welfare of the realm. Thus, the administration had to embody the same unity and order that the king claimed symbolically. Bureaucracy became a reflection of kingship, efficient, centralized, and absolute. Officials were expected to act as extensions of royal authority, ensuring that the emperor's commands were obeyed in every province. Religion and politics intertwined subtly under this system. The Nandas did not appear to favor one sect or belief system above others, but they used religious imagery to sanctify their rule. The notion of dharma, or cosmic law, became an instrument of state ideology. The king, by maintaining law and order, was portrayed as upholding dharma itself. In this way, obedience to the ruler was framed not only as a civic duty, but as a moral obligation. Such ideological grounding was crucial for holding together an empire as large and diverse as that of the Nandas. Conquered territories, each with its own traditions, languages, and local gods, needed a unifying principle that transcended regional loyalties. The image of the king as Ekarat served that purpose. It allowed different communities to imagine themselves as part of a larger cosmic order maintained by the monarch. At the same time, the ideology of universal kingship also served a practical function within the court itself. It justified the vast concentration of power in the hands of the king. In a system where authority came from divine mandate and the maintenance of order, dissent or rebellion could be framed as not merely political disloyalty, but moral transgression. This helped the Nandas maintain control over their officials and generals. discouraging the kind of factionalism that had weakened earlier dynasties. The wealth of the Nandas played a key role in sustaining their imperial ideology. Lavish patronage of temples, fortifications, and public works demonstrated the ruler's ability to command resources on a grand scale. The empire's surplus was not hoarded for luxury alone. It was transformed into monuments of legitimacy. Roads, canals, and fortified cities were all physical manifestations of the empire's unity and prosperity. To the subjects of the realm, such visible infrastructure was evidence that their king was indeed the sustainer of order. Even the heavy taxation that the Nandas imposed could be framed as part of this ideological order. Taxes were the price of peace and stability. By contributing to the treasury, subjects participated, willingly or not, in the maintenance of dharma. The system thus turned economic control into moral authority. Beyond the borders of Magadha, the reputation of the Nanda king spread far and wide. Travelers and traders carried stories of their immense wealth and formidable army. To neighboring rulers, the Nandas appeared as a force of nature, too powerful to confront directly. This external perception further reinforced the internal ideology of invincibility. When even distant lands acknowledged the might of Magadha, the claim of the king to be the sole ruler seemed less boastful and more inevitable. The title Ekarat also reshaped diplomacy. Subordinate rulers who accepted Nanda overlordship were incorporated into the imperial order not merely as defeated foes, but as participants in a greater cosmic hierarchy. Tribute payments and ceremonial visits to the Nanda court became acts of symbolic submission, acknowledging the universal kingship of the Magadhan monarch. The empire thus functioned as both a political and a moral system, an order where power and righteousness were fused. The ideological structure of the Nanda state, however, also sowed the seeds of future tension. The same centralization that made the ruler supreme left little room for shared governance or local autonomy. When all authority was embodied in the person of the king, any challenge to his image became a challenge to the entire system. Over time, as successors inherited the throne, maintaining the aura of divine kingship would become increasingly difficult. Yet in Mahapadma's time, the system worked with remarkable coherence. His rule marked a turning point in the history of Indian political thought. The Nanda experiment showed that power could be consolidated through an explicit political ideology rather than through lineage alone. It demonstrated that legitimacy could be manufactured through ritual, propaganda, and public works, just as effectively as it could be inherited. The success of this ideological project gave the Nandas not only stability, but also a legacy. Long after their dynasty fell, later rulers, from the Mauryas to the Guptas, would draw upon the same vocabulary of universal kingship, righteous rule, and imperial unity. The dream of Ekarat, the one ruler who holds the world in order, became one of the enduring themes of Indian statecraft. By the end of Mahapadma's reign, this ideology had become deeply entrenched in the empire's institutions. The bureaucracy, the army, and even the patterns of taxation all reflected the belief that the king's authority was absolute and indivisible. The people of Magadha, from ministers in the palace to farmers in distant provinces, lived within a world ordered by the vision of the sole ruler. The power of the Nanda Empire did not rest solely on its armies or the grandeur of its ideology. Behind every campaign, every fortress, and every royal ceremony stood a meticulously organized system of revenue and production. It was this fiscal engine, the control of money, grain, and metal, that sustained the vast imperial machinery and allowed the Nandas to dominate the subcontinent. Mahapadma Nanda's genius as a ruler was not only in conquest or administration, but in his ability to understand that power required resources, and resources required control. The Nandas ruled in an age when the economic foundations of Indian civilization were undergoing profound transformation. The spread of iron tools across the Gangetic plains had revolutionized agriculture. Forests were being cleared for cultivation, new villages were emerging, and grain surpluses were increasing. These developments created both opportunity and challenge for a ruler like Mahapadma. To maintain an empire, he needed to ensure that these surpluses could be measured, collected, and redistributed in a systematic way. At the heart of the Nanda fiscal system was the land. Agriculture formed the basis of wealth, and the king's authority was expressed through his control over land revenue. The empire's territory was divided into provinces and smaller administrative units, each with officials responsible for assessing and collecting taxes. Land was categorized according to fertility, and tax rates were adjusted to reflect productivity. This method, though far less elaborate than the one perfected later by the Mauryas, represented an early stage in the development of rational state finance. Taxation was not limited to land alone. The Nanda administration imposed levies on trade, craft production, mining, and forest resources. Marketplaces and river ports, vital nodes in the expanding network of commerce, were supervised by state officers who ensured that a share of every transaction flowed into the royal treasury. These taxes were not arbitrary extractions. They were standardized and recorded, reflecting the Nanda's preference for predictability and efficiency. The scale of the Nanda treasury became legendary. Later, Greek accounts, relayed through travelers and chroniclers, spoke of vast reserves of gold and silver, measured not by weight but by imagination. Though the figures are exaggerated, they reveal a core truth. The Nandas commanded resources on a scale unmatched by any earlier Indian dynasty. Their ability to collect, store, and manage wealth allowed them to maintain an enormous standing army, finance public works, and sustain a bureaucracy that spanned the subcontinent. Grain was as important as silver in this system. In an agrarian empire, grain functioned as both sustenance and currency. The state maintained large granaries in strategic locations, Pataliputra, Champa, Rajagriha, and other provincial centers, ensuring food security during droughts and sieges. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest as tax, and the surplus grain could be redistributed to feed soldiers, laborers, and officials. This capacity to convert agricultural abundance into military and administrative power was one of the Nanda's greatest strengths. The management of forests and mines further reinforced the state's dominance. The forests of Magadha and neighboring regions provided timber for construction, elephants for warfare, and honey, resin, and other valuable goods for trade. Mines yielded iron, copper, and precious metals, all of which were under royal supervision. By asserting ownership over natural resources, the Nanda kings reduced the autonomy of local chiefs and ensured that the profits of extraction benefited the central treasury. The circulation of money, too, expanded under their rule. The Nandas presided over an increasingly monetized economy, symbolized by the widespread use of punch-marked coins. These small pieces of silver, stamped with symbols rather than inscriptions, represented the earliest form of standardized currency in India. Their distribution across Nanda territories indicates not only the growth of trade but also the state's role in regulating economic exchange. Coinage made taxation more flexible, trade more efficient, and the payment of officials and soldiers more reliable. The existence of a monetary economy had profound administrative implications. Instead of relying entirely on barter or in-kind payments, the Nandas could levy taxes in coin, enabling them to accumulate portable and fungible wealth. This in turn facilitated long-distance trade and allowed the state to engage with merchant communities on equal terms. In effect, the Nanda fiscal system tied together rural producers, urban traders, and royal administrators in a single web of economic interdependence. Such integration required oversight, and oversight required records. While the original documentation of Nanda administration has not survived, later traditions and the structure of the Mauryan state suggest that the Nandas employed scribes and accountants to keep meticulous accounts of revenue and expenditure. These officials, drawn from the educated classes, formed the backbone of the bureaucracy. They ensured that taxes collected in distant provinces reached the central treasury and that royal orders concerning revenue were implemented without delay. The Nanda fiscal state also reflected a deeper understanding of political economy, that prosperity was both the foundation and the justification of rule. Mahapadma Nanda and his successors were not content to extract wealth. they sought to create it. By protecting trade routes, securing ports, and maintaining internal order, they fostered an environment in which commerce could flourish. Traders from distant lands, including those from the northwest and beyond the Himalayas, found the markets of Pataliputra and its satellite cities profitable and safe. This atmosphere of stability and security encouraged the growth of merchant guilds, organized associations of traders and artisans who coordinated production and trade. These guilds, known as shrenis, became an important element of the Nanda economy. They not only facilitated commerce but also provided a reliable source of revenue through taxes and duties. The state, in turn, offered protection and legal recognition, integrating them into its broader fiscal network. The wealth generated by this system was visible in the material culture of the time. Archaeological evidence from the Gangetic Plains reveals increasing urbanization, the spread of iron tools, and the use of brick architecture. Towns and cities thrived under Nanda protection, serving as centers of trade, administration, and craftsmanship. The prosperity of the empire was not confined to the elite. The urban and rural populations alike benefited from the economic activity stimulated by imperial stability. However, this prosperity came at a cost. The same taxation that enriched the state also placed a heavy burden on farmers and small producers. Later traditions, particularly Buddhist and Jain sources, remember the Nandas as harsh tax collectors, more concerned with filling the treasury than with the welfare of their subjects. These accounts, while colored by moral judgment, point to a real tension within the Nanda system. A centralized fiscal state, by its nature, required constant revenue. The pressure to maintain vast armies and public works meant that taxation remained relentless. In the short term, this approach ensured efficiency and power. In the long term, it created resentment among local elites and commoners alike. Yet the Nanda's ability to maintain stability despite such discontent speaks to the effectiveness of their governance. Their administrative machinery was too strong, their surveillance too thorough, and their army too imposing to allow rebellion to spread easily. The control of resources also had a cultural dimension. Wealth became a visible marker of royal virtue. The king's ability to accumulate treasure and fund public works was seen as proof of divine favor and administrative skill. Grand constructions, palaces, fortifications, irrigation systems, and possibly early road networks served not only practical functions but also ideological ones. They demonstrated that the ruler's prosperity was inseparable from the prosperity of the land. One remarkable feature of the Nanda fiscal system was its capacity for continuity. When the Mauryas eventually overthrew the dynasty, they did not dismantle the existing structures. Instead, they inherited and refined them. The Mauryan state described in the Arthashastra, with its sophisticated tax system, mining administration, and trade regulations, owed much to the groundwork laid by the Nandas. The idea that the state should control the economy, rather than merely benefit from it, was a Nanda innovation that shaped Indian governance for centuries. The fiscal strength of the Nandas also influenced the balance of power beyond India's borders. Western writers of the time, particularly those connected with Alexander's campaigns, spoke of an Indian king possessing immense wealth and a formidable army of war elephants. Whether or not these reports referred specifically to the Nandas, they reflect the impression that Magadha had become a center of enormous economic power, a kingdom so rich that even foreign conquerors hesitated to challenge it. The Nanda model of state finance was, in many respects, ahead of its time. It combined agricultural taxation with commercial levies, state monopolies over key resources, and a standardized system of record-keeping. This combination allowed the empire to function as a self-sustaining organism. Every harvest, every caravan, every mine contributed to the circulation of wealth that maintained both the material and symbolic strength of the monarchy. At the same time, the Nanda approach demonstrated a clear understanding of the relationship between economics and governance. Power could not exist without revenue, but revenue could not be collected without order. Thus, the fiscal state was also a moral state, built on the promise that the ruler would maintain stability and justice in exchange for the people's contribution. The king was not simply a tax collector, he was the guardian of prosperity itself. As Mahapadma's reign progressed, this vast fiscal apparatus became the lifeblood of the empire. The granaries fed the armies, the mines forged their weapons, and the coins paid their salaries. The wealth that flowed into Pataliputra financed not only the machinery of war, but also the daily operation of governance. Through the management of money, grain, and metal, the Nandas achieved what few before them had done. They transformed economic power into political permanence. Behind the splendor of Nanda wealth and the sophistication of its bureaucracy stood the one institution that made all others possible, the army. It was the sword and shield of the empire, the physical expression of its authority, and the ultimate guarantor of its stability. The Nandas built not merely a force of soldiers, but a true war machine, massive, organized, and continuous in operation. In scale and structure, it surpassed anything India had seen before. This was the instrument through which Mahapadma Nanda and his successors maintained control over their territories, deterred rivals, and projected Magadha's power across the subcontinent. The Nanda army's fame reached far beyond India's borders. Even distant Greek historians, writing decades later, spoke of an Indian ruler whose military might was so immense that Alexander's army, standing at the Beas River, refused to march eastward. These accounts, though exaggerated, capture a truth about the perception of the Nandas. They commanded forces of such magnitude and reputation that they inspired awe, even among the most seasoned warriors of the ancient world. The roots of this power lay in deliberate planning. The Nandas were among the first Indian rulers to maintain a large, permanent, and professional standing army. Earlier dynasties had relied on temporary levies, peasants called up for seasonal campaigns, supplemented by local militias. Mahapadma changed this pattern. His army was not a part-time force, but a full-time institution, paid and supplied directly by the state. This shift marked a turning point in Indian military history, transforming warfare from a noble pursuit into a bureaucratically managed enterprise. The army's organization was divided into distinct branches: infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. This fourfold division, known in Sanskrit as the Chaturanga, would later become the standard model for classical Indian armies. Each branch had its own commanders, supply officers, and specialized units. The coordination of these diverse forces required a level of logistical sophistication that only a centralized state like the Nanda Empire could sustain. Infantry formed the backbone of the army. Recruited from across the empire, these soldiers were trained, equipped, and paid by the state. They carried spears, bows, and swords of iron, as well as shields of wood or hide. Discipline and organization were emphasized, for the army's size demanded order above all. Infantry units marched in formation, their movements directed by officers who communicated through drums, conch shells, and flags. The cavalry represented a newer and more mobile arm of warfare. Horses, imported from northwestern India and Central Asia, were expensive and required careful breeding and training. The Nandas invested heavily in their upkeep, maintaining stables and pastures under royal supervision. Cavalry units provided the speed and flexibility that large armies often lacked. They could scout, pursue retreating enemies, and strike quickly at weak points in the enemy's line. Chariots, though declining in importance compared to earlier centuries, still held ceremonial and tactical value. Drawn by horses and manned by skilled warriors, they carried archers and spearmen into battle. In open terrain, chariots could break enemy ranks through sheer momentum. More importantly, they symbolized royal prestige. Commanders and princes were often seen leading from chariots, embodying the image of heroic kingship rooted in the ancient epics. Yet the most formidable component of the Nanda army was its corps of war elephants. These massive animals, drawn from the forests of eastern and central India, were trained for battle and adorned with armor and decorations. Each elephant carried a driver and several warriors armed with javelins or bows. Their presence on the battlefield had a devastating psychological effect. Enemy horses often panicked at the sight and scent of elephants, and infantry formations could be trampled or scattered in moments. The elephants also served as living fortresses. Their thick hides, combined with armor, made them nearly invulnerable to ordinary weapons. The Nanda's command of hundreds, possibly thousands of war elephants gave them a decisive edge over neighboring states. These creatures became symbols of imperial might, emblems of strength that reinforced the image of the Nanda ruler as Ekarat, the sole master of the world. Maintaining such an army required vast logistical effort. Supplies of food, weapons, armor, and fodder had to reach every unit on campaign. Grain for men and forage for animals were stockpiled in depots along major routes. Artisans in state-run workshops forged weapons and repaired equipment. The Nandas likely established an organized corps of engineers responsible for building roads, bridges, and fortifications, as well as maintaining siege engines such as catapults and battering rams. The financing of this immense military apparatus drew upon the empire's rich fiscal system. Soldiers were paid regular salaries, often in coin, ensuring their loyalty to the state rather than to local chieftains. Officers were appointed based on merit and efficiency, reflecting Mahapadma's preference for professional service over hereditary privilege. The constant employment of the army also ensured that veterans formed a disciplined corps, ready for both conquest and defense. In peacetime, the army's presence reinforced royal authority. Garrison towns were established throughout the empire, particularly near provincial capitals, trade centers, and border regions. These garrisons acted as both military bases and administrative outposts, ensuring that the king's orders were enforced and that taxes were collected without resistance. The sight of soldiers in Nanda service, uniformed, armed, and disciplined, was a daily reminder of the power that flowed from Pataliputra. The army's organization extended beyond the battlefield into intelligence and communication. The Nandas maintained a network of couriers and informants who carried news between the capital and the provinces. Spies gathered information on local politics, possible rebellions, and the movements of foreign powers. This early intelligence system, later perfected under the Mauryas, gave the Nandas the ability to anticipate threats and suppress dissent before it could spread. The Nanda emphasis on military strength was not purely defensive. Expansion remained a central goal. When diplomacy failed, armies marched. Each campaign brought new territories under control, and each victory reinforced the ideological claim of universal kingship. Yet conquest was not pursued recklessly. Mahapadma understood that maintaining supply lines and consolidating gains mattered as much as battlefield success. Thus, Nanda campaigns were methodical, emphasizing endurance and administration over rapid glory. The scale of these operations impressed even those far removed from India. When Alexander of Macedon reached the Indus Valley, he heard from local rulers and envoys about the mighty king who ruled in the east, a ruler with an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands and thousands of elephants ready for war. The Macedonian soldiers, already exhausted by years of campaigning, refused to advance further into India. Whether or not they truly faced the prospect of confronting the Nandas, the legend of their power was enough to halt the world's greatest conqueror. The Nanda war machine thus achieved more than territorial control. It shaped India's reputation abroad. In Greek and Persian imagination, India became a land of immeasurable wealth and military might, guarded by elephants and ruled by an invincible monarch. This perception would influence the diplomacy of later empires, including the Mauryas, who inherited both the army and the legend of Nanda power. Domestically, the army functioned as a stabilizing force. Its presence deterred rebellion and external invasion alike. Border tribes, raiders, and rival chieftains found it impossible to challenge the centralized might of Magadha. The empire's internal peace, so crucial for economic prosperity, was maintained by the knowledge that defiance could be met with overwhelming force. The Nanda military system also had an important social dimension. It provided employment and mobility for men from diverse backgrounds. Unlike earlier warrior orders restricted to noble lineages, the Nanda army drew recruits from all classes. This inclusiveness, though driven by practicality, reflected the changing nature of society. Merit, loyalty, and discipline became paths to advancement within the ranks. For many, Service in the imperial army offered a rare opportunity to gain status and stability in an era of expanding state power. The influence of the military extended even into the empire's culture. Royal ceremonies often featured displays of elephants, horses, and armed processions, reinforcing the image of the king as the supreme commander. The idea of danda, the power to punish, became central to the political philosophy of the period. The ruler's ability to enforce order through disciplined force was seen as a moral necessity, not merely a practical one. The army, therefore, was not just an instrument of war, but an embodiment of law and authority. Yet the very strength of the military carried within it the seeds of potential strain. Supporting such a vast institution required continuous revenue, and the burden of taxation on the population was immense. The cost of maintaining soldiers, elephants, and horses was staggering. As long as the empire expanded and its economy flourished, this system could sustain itself. But in times of stagnation or succession crises, the same army that upheld the state could become a source of instability. Once Nanda had forged his empire and secured it through wealth and military strength, his greatest challenge was to govern it. The Nanda dominion stretched across multiple regions, each with its own languages, customs, and traditions. Unifying these diverse lands required not only power, but also an efficient system of administration. The Nandas created such a system, one that combined central authority with local oversight, discipline with adaptability. It was a model of governance that would shape the political evolution of India for centuries. The key to Nanda governance lay in organization. Mahapadma and his successors understood that conquest alone could not sustain an empire. They needed a system capable of translating royal orders from the palace at Pataliputra into effective action hundreds of miles away. This required layers of bureaucracy, clear lines of command, and regular channels of communication. The empire thus functioned as a structured hierarchy in which every official, from the provincial governor to the village headman, played a defined role. At the top of this structure stood the king. In Nanda ideology, the monarch was not merely a political leader, but the embodiment of order itself. His authority was absolute, and all administrative functions ultimately derived from his will. The royal court at Pataliputra served as the empire's central hub, coordinating taxation, justice, and military operations. Ministers and secretaries worked under the king's supervision, maintaining records and ensuring that instructions were transmitted accurately to the provinces. To manage such a vast realm, the Nandas divided their territories into administrative units. At the highest level were the provinces, each governed by a royal appointee, usually a trusted general, noble, or bureaucrat. These governors wielded considerable authority but remained accountable to the central court. Beneath them were districts and sub-districts managed by subordinate officials. The structure was both vertical and interlocking, ensuring that information and resources flowed efficiently between the center and the periphery. Provincial governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining law and order, and overseeing local defense. They acted as both administrators and judges, resolving disputes and enforcing royal decrees. Regular reports were expected from each province, detailing revenue collection, agricultural output, and public order. Messengers and scribes carried these documents to Pataliputra, where clerks compiled them into the empire's central records. This system of continuous reporting kept the king informed and allowed him to respond quickly to potential problems. Within each district, smaller officials managed specific aspects of administration. There were officers for revenue, officers for public works, and officers for trade and market regulation. The Nandas placed particular emphasis on standardization. Weights, measures, and taxation methods were made uniform across the empire. This reduced confusion and facilitated commerce. For a farmer in Kosala or a merchant in Kalinga, the rules of taxation and trade were the same as those enforced in Magadha itself. Such standardization was crucial for maintaining unity in a multi-ethnic empire. It gave subjects a sense of predictable order, while also reinforcing the central government's authority. The local elites, village headmen, landowners, and guild leaders, were incorporated into this system as intermediaries. They collected taxes on behalf of the state and were rewarded with recognition or privileges in return. By integrating these figures into the bureaucracy, the Nandas reduced the likelihood of rebellion and fostered loyalty to the crown. The Nanda administration also invested in infrastructure. Roads were maintained and expanded, facilitating both trade and military movement. Ferries and bridges connected riverbanks, while canals supported irrigation in agricultural regions. These works were not merely practical conveniences. They were symbols of good governance. The ability to build and maintain such systems demonstrated the state's capacity to manage the environment and ensure prosperity for its people. Public works also served as instruments of control. By maintaining roads, the state ensured that armies could move quickly in response to uprisings. By regulating water supply, it controlled the agricultural output on which local populations depended. The Nanda administration thus turned geography itself into a tool of governance. Law and justice were another cornerstone of the empire's administration. The Nandas inherited a complex legal tradition rooted in both customary practices and royal edicts. In rural areas, village assemblies continued to handle minor disputes, but serious crimes and administrative offenses were judged by royal officials. The underlying principle of Nanda law was order, preserving stability and deterring rebellion. Punishments were often severe, reflecting the belief that fear maintained discipline. Theft, corruption, and sedition were treated as grave offenses. At the same time, records suggest that the state recognized the importance of fairness in taxation and justice. Officials who abused their authority could face penalties, for a corrupt bureaucracy threatened the very foundation of centralized rule. This emphasis on accountability, though imperfect, reveals the Nanda's awareness that justice was as much a tool of governance as coercion. Communication across the empire relied on an organized network of messengers, couriers, and spies. The Nandas, like later dynasties, used espionage as an essential part of administration. Agents reported on provincial officials, military officers, and even members of the royal family. Their reports allowed the king to identify disloyalty or inefficiency early. This system of surveillance ensured that authority remained firmly in royal hands and that no provincial power could act independently. The integration of intelligence into administration also reflects the pragmatic spirit of the Nanda state. Power, for Mahapadma and his successors, was not merely about grandeur or divine sanction. It was about information. To rule effectively, the king had to know the condition of his empire in detail. The harvest yield, the behavior of his officials, and the mood of his people. The Nandas' success in maintaining control over such a vast territory suggests that this system worked with remarkable precision. Urban governance formed another layer of Nanda administration. Cities like Pataliputra, Champa, and Rajagriha were managed by appointed officials responsible for sanitation, market regulation, and policing. These cities were economic engines of the empire, and their order was vital to the state's functioning. Urban administrators oversaw the maintenance of streets, the collection of tolls, and the enforcement of trade laws. They also coordinated with merchant guilds to ensure that commerce flowed smoothly and fairly. One of the most striking aspects of Nanda administration was its emphasis on record-keeping. Bureaucratic documentation was the empire's nervous system. Tax registers, inventories, and military rosters were maintained with care. The use of written records allowed for consistency over time and across distance. This reliance on documentation marked a shift from the oral and customary governance of earlier centuries to a more formalized and impersonal system, a true administrative state. Education and training were integral to this bureaucratic world. Scribes, accountants, and officials were drawn from literate classes familiar with arithmetic, measurement, and record-keeping. They represented a new social group, one whose status derived not from birth but from service to the state. The rise of this bureaucratic class reflected the transformation of Indian society under the Nandas. The old aristocracy of warriors and nobles gave way to a new elite of administrators and financiers. The Nanda model of governance was not without its costs. Centralization demanded uniform obedience, and deviations from policy were rarely tolerated. The surveillance system, while effective, also bred fear and suspicion. Local initiative was often stifled by the weight of bureaucracy. Nevertheless, this system provided an unprecedented level of stability in a region that had long been divided by competing powers. The effectiveness of Nanda administration is evident in its endurance. When Chandragupta Maurya overthrew the dynasty, he did not dismantle its structure. Instead, he inherited and refined it, building upon the same foundations of bureaucracy, taxation, and law. The Nandas had demonstrated that India could be governed not as a patchwork of kingdoms, but as a single, organized state. Their innovations laid the groundwork for the imperial systems that followed. The integration of law, administration, and infrastructure under the Nandas represented a new stage in political development. The empire had become more than a collection of conquests. It was now a functioning organism, capable of managing its economy, enforcing its will, and sustaining its identity across vast distances. For the first time in Indian history, governance had become an art of systems rather than personalities. This achievement, however, carried inherent risks. The very efficiency of the administration made it dependent on the competence and loyalty of its officials. Corruption, mismanagement, or rebellion within the bureaucracy could undermine the entire structure. Moreover, as power became concentrated in the hands of a few, resentment grew among those excluded from it. The local elites, the traditional priestly classes, and the overburdened taxpayers. The consolidation of the Nanda Empire and the efficiency of its administration set the stage for one of the most dynamic developments of the age, the flourishing of cities and commerce. Under Nanda rule, urban life in the Gangetic Plains reached a level of activity and organization unseen before. The empire's wealth, infrastructure, and stability turned its heartland into a network of thriving towns and bustling markets where merchants, artisans, and travelers from distant lands met under the protection of a strong state. Urbanization had deep roots in the eastern Gangetic Valley, but the Nanda period marked a decisive transformation in its scale and character. Earlier kingdoms had relied primarily on agrarian wealth, with towns serving as royal or religious centers. The Nandas, however, recognized that cities could become engines of economic growth and instruments of control. They actively encouraged the expansion of urban settlements, linking them to the imperial administration and trade networks that bound the subcontinent together. At the center of this urban world stood Pataliputra, the imperial capital. Situated at the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers, it was both a natural fortress and a hub of commerce. Its riverine position gave it access to the agricultural heartlands of Magadha and to the wider trade routes that connected northern India to the eastern coast and the northwestern frontier. The city's layout reflected both administrative precision and civic vitality. Wooden palisades enclosed its broad avenues, residential quarters, warehouses, and markets. Inside its walls, the rhythms of governance, trade, and everyday life merged into a single pulse. Pataliputra was more than a political capital. It was the symbol of a new kind of civilization. Here, scribes kept records of revenue, merchants exchanged goods, artisans worked in guilds, and soldiers patrolled the streets to maintain order. Foreign envoys and traders described it as a city of immense wealth, filled with granaries, gardens, and palaces. The Greek historian Megasthenes, who later visited the same city under the Mauryas, described its grandeur in detail, but the foundations of that prosperity were laid during the Nanda era. Beyond Pataliputra, other towns flourished under Nanda rule. Rajagriha, the old capital of Magadha, remained a significant center of trade and religious learning. Champa, located on the banks of the Ganges, served as a key river port linking the interior to eastern markets. Vaishali and Kashi, ancient cities with deep cultural roots, adapted to the new imperial order by becoming important commercial and administrative nodes. Together, these urban centers formed a dense network that connected the rural hinterlands with the arteries of long-distance trade. Commerce under the Nandas thrived on both land and river routes. The empire's roadways, many of which would later be integrated into the Mauryan system, linked major cities across the Ganges plain. Caravans of ox-drawn carts carried grain, salt, textiles, and metal goods from one market to another. The rivers, meanwhile, served as the highways of trade. Boats transported goods along the Ganges, Sun, and their tributaries, connecting the agricultural interior with distant coastal regions such as Kalinga and Bengal. This expansion of trade brought about profound economic change. Markets grew larger and more specialized, and a new class of professional merchants emerged. These traders, often organized into guilds, played a vital role in the empire's economy. They managed caravans, negotiated with officials, and maintained networks that stretched beyond Magadha's borders. Their wealth gave them influence, and their cooperation was essential to the functioning of the state's fiscal system. The rise of guilds, or shrenis, reflected the increasing complexity of urban life. These associations united people of the same craft or trade, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, jewelers, and merchants, into self-regulating bodies. A guild could own property, lend money, and represent its members before the authorities. It maintained internal discipline and standards of production, ensuring quality and stability in a growing market. By providing credit, insurance, and mutual aid, guilds became both economic and social institutions. The state maintained a close but balanced relationship with these urban organizations. On one hand, it taxed their activities, collected duties on goods, and regulated market practices. On the other, it offered protection, legal recognition, and infrastructure that facilitated their operations. The stability provided by Nanda governance allowed these institutions to flourish, fostering a degree of economic sophistication that would endure into later centuries. Trade extended far beyond the borders of Magadha. The Nanda Empire's geographic position made it the crossroads of multiple trade routes. To the northwest, goods traveled toward the Punjab and beyond into the Persian-influenced regions of Gandhara. To the east, traders moved through Bengal toward the sea, exporting textiles, beads, and spices. To the south, routes ran through the forests of central India toward the Deccan Plateau, where agricultural and mineral wealth awaited exchange. Through these corridors flowed not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. Among the most important commodities in Nanda markets were agricultural products, grain, oilseeds, and pulses, supplemented by luxury items such as fine textiles, ivory, and precious stones. Iron tools and weapons, produced in state-supervised workshops, were traded widely, fueling both agriculture and warfare. The control of mineral resources gave the Nandas a monopoly on key materials like copper and iron, ensuring that their coins and weapons were both plentiful and standardized. Monetization deepened during this period. The widespread use of punch-marked coins facilitated trade across regions and social groups. These small silver coins, stamped with distinctive symbols, allowed merchants to transact efficiently and travelers to carry wealth securely. Their circulation across Nanda territory reflects a remarkable degree of economic integration. The coins also represented a subtle assertion of royal authority. The symbols stamped upon them were not mere decoration, but signs of state validation and trust. Urban markets were vibrant spaces of exchange and interaction. Merchants shouted prices, artisans displayed their wares, and farmers brought in produce from the countryside. Women participated actively in trade and craft production, managing stalls, spinning textiles, or working within family workshops. The diversity of goods available, from local pottery to imported gems, illustrates the cosmopolitan character of the Nanda economy. The expansion of commerce also influenced cultural life. Cities became centers of learning and debate, where ideas from different traditions met and mingled. The intellectual movements of the period, Buddhism, Jainism, and the evolving schools of Vedic philosophy, found fertile ground in these urban spaces. Merchants and craftsmen, exposed to varied philosophies and ways of life, often supported religious institutions through donations and endowments. This blend of material prosperity and moral inquiry gave Nanda-era cities a distinctive cultural vitality. The growing urban population also brought challenges. Crowding, sanitation, and social tension were constant concerns. The Nanda administration responded with regulation and oversight. Urban officials were tasked with maintaining cleanliness, managing waste disposal, and preventing fires, common hazards in densely built wooden towns. Police ensured public order and protected markets from theft and fraud. These practical measures reveal an emerging sense of civic management that complemented the empire's broader administrative system. Social mobility increased as urbanization progressed. In a world once dominated by hereditary privilege, the city offered opportunities for those with skill and ambition. Merchants accumulated wealth, scribes gained prestige through literacy, and soldiers found employment in the army or city garrisons. The rigid hierarchies of rural society softened within the urban environment, replaced by a more fluid social structure shaped by occupation and wealth. At the same time, economic inequality deepened. The grandeur of royal palaces and merchant mansions stood in stark contrast to the crowded dwellings of laborers and artisans. This disparity was tolerated as long as prosperity continued to flow, but it hinted at the tensions that could later surface when the balance of wealth and power shifted. Despite these complexities, the urban heartland of the Nanda Empire represented one of the great achievements of ancient Indian civilization. The combination of political stability, economic planning, and infrastructural investment created an environment in which cities could thrive. They were not isolated enclaves, but integral parts of a larger imperial system, a web of trade, administration, and culture centered on Pataliputra. The Nanda emphasis on commerce and urban development had lasting consequences. When the Mauryas later inherited the empire, they built upon the same foundations. The roads, ports, and markets established during the Nanda period continued to serve as the backbone of imperial administration. The cities that had grown under Nanda protection became the hubs of Mauryan trade and governance. As the Nanda Empire reached the height of its wealth and power, its rulers faced a challenge that no army or treasury could easily solve: the challenge of legitimacy. Mahapadma Nanda and his successors had built a vast state sustained by disciplined administration and immense resources, but the very structure that made the empire efficient also deepened social divisions. The Nanda's rise had disrupted the traditional order of Indian society, and their methods of governance, though effective, left parts of the population alienated and resentful. The Nanda dynasty's origins were unusual, and that fact mattered profoundly in the social world of ancient India. Earlier kings of Magadha had claimed descent from noble warrior families, the Kshatriyas, whose right to rule was sanctioned by lineage and ritual. Mahapadma Nanda, however, was remembered in later traditions as a ruler of lower social origin. Some texts describe his mother as belonging to a merchant or Shudra family, while others portray him as a usurper who overthrew the established dynasty. Whether these accounts are historically accurate or not, they reflect how his reign challenged the norms of caste and hierarchy that had long structured Indian society. To many of his contemporaries, Mahapadma's rule represented a social revolution. He had risen not through birth, but through ability and force. For the first time in Indian history, power at the highest level was detached from traditional caste privilege. The old aristocracies of Kuru, Panchala, and Kosala, once proud of their warrior status, had been subdued or eliminated. The Puranas even call Mahapadma the destroyer of the Kshatriyas, a phrase that captures both his military success and the social upheaval it symbolized. The Brahmanical tradition, which placed the priestly class at the top of the social hierarchy, viewed this transformation with unease. In the Vedic world, the relationship between kings and Brahmins had been symbiotic. Rulers derived legitimacy from ritual consecration, while priests gained patronage and prestige. The Nandas, however, based their authority on wealth, bureaucracy, and military strength rather than ritual sanction. They did not depend on Brahmins to legitimize their rule in the old way. Instead, they created a form of kingship grounded in power and order, a secular ideology of control that diminished the influence of traditional religious elites. This shift generated hostility among orthodox groups. Later, Hindu texts often portray the Nandas as greedy, irreligious, or even impious. The image of the avaricious king who taxed his people excessively and hoarded treasure may owe as much to ideological resentment as to economic reality. The Brahmanical writers who preserved these stories were expressing not only moral disapproval, but also the discomfort of a class that had lost its privileged relationship with the throne. For the common people, the Nandas' rule was more complex. On one hand, their policies brought stability, prosperity, and protection. Trade flourished, cities grew, and the countryside was largely secure from invasion. On the other hand, the centralization of power came with heavy taxation and strict surveillance. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants alike contributed to the empire's vast revenue system, but few shared directly in its benefits. Over time, the contrast between the opulence of the royal court and the burdens of taxation created resentment among those who bore the costs of empire. The Nandas' reputation for immense wealth became a double-edged sword. Their treasury was the envy of the known world, but it also became a symbol of excess. Legends told of vaults filled with gold and silver, guarded by loyal soldiers and hidden beneath the palace at Pataliputra. Greek sources, drawing on tales from traders and emissaries, spoke of an Indian king whose riches surpassed imagination. Within India, these same riches became a focus of moral criticism. Buddhist and Jain texts describe the Nanda kings as obsessed with accumulation, contrasting their materialism with the ethical teachings of renunciation that were gaining popularity during the same period. The growth of new religious movements intensified the critique of Nanda rule. Buddhism and Jainism, both of which had emerged in the Magadha region, offered alternative visions of society, ones that emphasized personal virtue over birth and moral authority over royal power. The teachings of the Buddha and Mahavira had already found followers among merchants, artisans, and commoners, groups who often felt marginalized by the older hierarchies. Under the Nandas, these communities flourished economically but remained politically subordinate. Their growing numbers and moral influence introduced a new tension into Magadha's social fabric. The contrast between the king's worldly power and the moral ideals of renunciation and compassion that now circulated among his subjects. It would be wrong, however, to imagine the Nandas as indifferent tyrants. Their approach to legitimacy was pragmatic rather than ideological. Recognizing that they could not rely solely on caste or ritual for support, they sought to secure loyalty through performance and provision. Public works, fortifications, and the maintenance of law and order were visible demonstrations of royal responsibility. The Nanda court projected an image of efficiency and prosperity, implying that good governance itself was the king's justification for rule. Ritual still played a role, but it was reinterpreted. The Nanda kings likely continued to perform ceremonies associated with kingship, such as the Rajasuya or Ashvamedha, though these may have taken on new meanings. Rather than serving to confirm ancient lineage, they showcased the ruler's ability to command resources and uphold universal order. In this sense, Mahapadma Nanda did not reject the old symbols of kingship. He repurposed them to fit a new political reality. At court, the king's legitimacy was reinforced through spectacle and ceremony. Processions, public audiences, and military parades displayed the power of the throne. The court poets and chroniclers, though their works have not survived, must have celebrated the Nandas as bringers of peace and prosperity. In doing so, they helped transform royal authority into a public performance, one that communicated strength to subjects and rivals alike. The social world of the Nanda Empire was therefore one of contrasts and contradictions. It was a time of unprecedented mobility when talent and ambition could elevate individuals regardless of birth. The bureaucracy, the army, and the merchant guilds all offered new paths to influence. Yet the very mechanisms that enabled this mobility, centralized power, wealth accumulation, and state control, also generated friction between rulers and ruled. Among the Brahmins, resentment stemmed from lost privilege; among the merchants, from taxation; among the farmers, from extraction; and among the commoners from the impersonality of bureaucratic governance. The Nanda's reliance on surveillance and punishment, though effective in maintaining order, may have deepened the perception that they ruled through fear rather than moral authority. These tensions did not immediately threaten the stability of the empire, but they eroded its moral foundation. Power built on wealth and coercion could endure only as long as it remained effective. Once efficiency faltered through mismanagement, succession disputes, or external pressures, the lack of deep social legitimacy would become a serious vulnerability. In the cultural memory of India, the Nandas occupy an ambiguous place. They are remembered both as powerful administrators and as oppressive rulers. Their achievements, centralization, economic integration, and bureaucratic discipline, were immense, yet their image in later literature is often unflattering. This dual legacy reflects the paradox of their reign. They brought order through force, prosperity through taxation, and unity through domination. Still, the social transformations they set in motion would outlast their dynasty. The decline of hereditary aristocracy, the rise of a bureaucratic class, and the growth of urban commerce all reshaped Indian society in enduring ways. The Nandas may have been unpopular among traditional elites, but they prepared the ground for a more merit-based and economically dynamic order. As the Nanda Empire consolidated its hold over northern India, a far-reaching transformation was unfolding beyond its western frontiers. Across the rugged passes of the Hindu Kush and the plains of the Indus Valley, the ancient Achaemenid Empire, once the greatest power in the known world, was crumbling. The collapse of this Persian colossus in the late 4th century BCE would send ripples across Asia, reshaping trade routes, political alliances, and the balance of power from the Mediterranean to the Ganges. For the Nandas, who ruled at the opposite end of this vast continent, these changes would bring both opportunity and challenge. To understand the significance of this global shift, one must first recall the reach of Achaemenid influence. For nearly 2 centuries, Persian kings, from Cyrus the Great to Darius I, had governed an empire that stretched from Egypt and Anatolia in the west to the fringes of India in the east. The Indus region, known to the Persians as Hindush, was part of their dominion. Local satraps, or governors, administered the lands corresponding roughly to modern-day Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. These territories formed the easternmost provinces of the empire, linked to the Persian heartland by a network of roads and administrative systems that mirrored those later developed independently in India. Persian rule brought the Indus lands into contact with the wider currents of imperial governance. The Achaemenids introduced coinage, standardized weights, and bureaucratic practices that influenced the economies of Gandhara, Sindh, and Punjab. The presence of Persian garrisons and officials also exposed local elites to new ideas of centralized administration, concepts that found echoes in the later organization of the Nanda and Mauryan states. By the time Mahapadma Nanda rose to power in Magadha, however, the Achaemenid Empire was in decline. Internal rebellions, economic strain, and the growing power of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander had weakened its hold over the east. When Alexander invaded Persia in the late 4th century BCE, he toppled an empire already fragile from within. Within a decade, the great Achaemenid system collapsed, leaving a power vacuum across its former territories, including the frontier regions that bordered India. For the Indian subcontinent, this collapse was a moment of both uncertainty and transformation. The northwestern provinces that had once been part of the Persian administrative sphere, Gandhara, Cambodia, and parts of the Punjab, were now left without a unifying authority. Local rulers and city-states reasserted independence, some governed by Persianized elites, others by indigenous dynasties. Trade routes that had once been guarded by Persian satraps now became zones of competition and instability. The Nandas, whose empire was centered in the Gangetic Plain, likely viewed these developments with cautious interest. Though Magadha's heartland lay far from the Indus frontier, the Nandas were aware of the strategic and economic importance of the northwestern regions. The Indus Valley was the gateway through which goods, ideas, and sometimes armies passed between India and the Western world. Whoever controlled it could influence the flow of commerce in gold, horses, and fine textiles that linked India to Central Asia and beyond. The fall of Persia also opened new possibilities for contact between India and the Mediterranean world. Greek and Macedonian adventurers began to appear in the eastern satrapies, bringing news of distant lands and a curiosity about the rich kingdoms that lay beyond the Indus. These travelers carried with them stories of a powerful empire to the east, an empire ruled by a king with immense wealth and an army of countless elephants. They were speaking, almost certainly, of the Nandas. It is unlikely that the Nandas themselves maintained direct relations with the Achaemenids or their successors, but they were not isolated from these global currents. Trade routes connecting Magadha to the northwest remained active, carrying textiles, spices, and metals toward Persia and returning with horses, silver, and luxury goods. Caravans moved along the northern routes through Gandhara and Bactria, while maritime trade linked the ports of Kalinga and Bengal to the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. The collapse of Achaemenid authority may have disrupted some of these networks, but it also created opportunities for Indian merchants to assert greater control over eastern trade. The Persian legacy, however, lingered. The Achaemenids had pioneered many features of imperial organization that would later resonate in Indian statecraft. The use of appointed governors, the building of roads for communication, and the maintenance of large standing armies funded through taxation. These concepts, transmitted through centuries of contact, influenced the administrative ethos of the Nandas and, later, the Mauryas. Some scholars have even suggested that the very idea of a universal empire, a realm stretching across diverse peoples under one ruler, may have gained renewed plausibility in India through awareness of Persian precedents. The cultural effects of Persia's fall were equally significant. Gandhara, the region straddling modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, became a melting pot of Greek, Persian, and Indian influences. After the Achaemenid collapse, it evolved into a vibrant frontier zone where ideas from east and west mingled. This cultural fusion would later give rise to the distinctive Greco-Buddhist art of the Mauryan and post-Mauryan periods. But its first seeds were planted in the age of transition between Persian decline and Indian consolidation. Within India, the Nandas' awareness of shifting power dynamics in the West likely reinforced their determination to strengthen their own frontiers. Though there is no record of direct Nanda campaigns into the northwestern territories, their administration maintained a watchful eye on developments beyond the Indus. Reports of unrest, new alliances, or foreign incursions would have reached Pataliputra through networks of merchants and spies. The Nanda rulers, pragmatic and cautious, preferred to secure their internal stability before engaging with external threats. This caution was well-founded, for events in the West soon took an extraordinary turn. In the aftermath of the Persian collapse, Alexander of Macedon launched his campaign of conquest that would carry him across Asia. After defeating Darius III, he turned his attention eastward, determined to reach the lands once ruled by the Achaemenids, and beyond them, the mysterious kingdoms of India. When Alexander's armies crossed into the Indus Valley, they encountered local rulers who had long existed on the periphery of both Persian and Indian worlds. Some submitted willingly to Macedonian rule, seeing advantage in alliance. Others resisted fiercely. The battles at places like the Hyphasis River, where Alexander faced King Porus, marked the meeting of two great civilizations. Yet even as the Macedonian armies triumphed in the Punjab, they were aware of what lay farther east, the vast empire of the Nandas. Greek sources describe Alexander's officers debating whether to march onward into the lands of the Ganges. Scouts and local informants warned them of an enormous army awaiting beyond the plains, a force of hundreds of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and more war elephants than any Western army had ever faced. This was the Nanda army, the formidable machine that guarded the eastern frontier of India. The prospect of confronting such a power, combined with exhaustion and homesickness, convinced Alexander's troops to turn back. The encounter between Macedon and India was brief but consequential. It brought the subcontinent to the attention of the Western world, introducing Greek thinkers to Indian philosophy and geography, and leaving behind Greek-speaking communities in the frontier regions. For the Nandas, Alexander's withdrawal confirmed their reputation as an empire so formidable that even the greatest conqueror of the age dared not challenge it directly. Yet, the Macedonian incursion also changed the political landscape of the Northwest. The withdrawal of Alexander's army left behind a patchwork of satraps and local rulers, some Greek, some Indian. The power vacuum created by their rivalries would eventually draw the attention of Chandragupta Maurya, who, under the guidance of Chanakya, would rise to fill it. But during the late Nanda period, these events remained distant tremors, warnings of a new era approaching. Back in Pataliputra, the Nanda court must have viewed these Western developments with both pride and apprehension. Pride because their empire's reputation had reached distant lands. Apprehension because the collapse of great empires elsewhere served as a reminder that no power was eternal. The fate of Persia showed that even the most formidable systems could falter when overextended or internally divided. For the Nandas, who ruled through centralization and wealth, this lesson was both timely and ominous. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into the northwestern fringes of the Indian subcontinent in the late 4th century BCE, he entered a world already shaped by centuries of Indian and Persian civilization. The lands beyond the Indus had once formed the easternmost provinces of the Achaemenid Empire, and though Persian control had collapsed, its influence lingered in the form of fortified cities, trade routes, and administrative customs. Yet beyond these frontiers lay another world entirely, a land of immense wealth, vast rivers, and powerful kingdoms. The Macedonian conqueror, whose armies had swept from Greece to Babylon, now set his eyes on the mysterious realm of the Nandas. For the Greeks, India had long been a land of legend. Earlier travelers and traders had brought home stories of gold, elephants, and wise philosophers who lived in forests and preached simplicity. To Alexander, these stories were not only curiosities, but a challenge. Having conquered the Persian Empire, he sought to surpass his predecessors by reaching the ends of the world. In his imagination, India was the final frontier, a place where the limits of his empire and of human endurance would be tested. In 3 long years of campaigning, Alexander moved through the territories of Bactria and Arachosia, subduing local rulers and installing satraps to govern in his name. By the time he reached the Indus River, his army had endured years of exhaustion and hardship. Still, they advanced eastward, crossing into the Punjab, where they encountered a mosaic of small kingdoms, tribes, and republics. These states, though politically fragmented, were culturally sophisticated and economically prosperous, enriched by trade routes that connected them to both India and Central Asia. One of the most famous encounters of this campaign was with King Porus, the ruler of a territory between the Hydaspes, Jhelum, and Assisines, Chenab rivers. Porus commanded a formidable army equipped with war elephants, an innovation the Macedonians had never before faced. The battle that followed, fought in the monsoon rains on the banks of the Hydaspes, was one of the hardest of Alexander's career. Porus's elephants charged into the Macedonian lines, creating chaos among men and horses alike. Only through superior tactics and determination did Alexander achieve victory. Yet, even in defeat, Porus impressed his conqueror. According to Greek accounts, when Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "As a king would treat a king." Admiring his courage, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and even granted him additional territories. This gesture of magnanimity was partly strategic. Alexander needed strong local allies to secure his new conquests. As his armies moved farther eastward, however, Alexander encountered resistance not only from warriors but also from nature and fatigue. The monsoon rains drenched his troops, rivers swelled beyond control, and disease spread through the camps. Still, he pressed forward, intent on reaching the mighty Ganges River, the heart of the Indian world. It was during this phase that Alexander first heard detailed reports about the empire of the Nandas. Local rulers and informants described a great kingdom to the east, centered on Pataliputra, ruled by a monarch of immense wealth and commanding an army larger than any in the known world. The descriptions varied, but all agreed on one thing. The Nanda king's forces were vast beyond imagination. Greek historians, relying on the reports of Alexander's scouts, recorded that the Nandas could muster 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 2,000 chariots, and 3,000 elephants. While these figures were almost certainly exaggerated, they conveyed an essential truth. The Nanda Empire possessed the largest and most formidable military power in India. To men who had just fought desperately against Porus's much smaller army, the idea of facing such a force was terrifying. The psychological impact of this intelligence cannot be overstated. The Macedonian soldiers, exhausted from years of campaigning and unnerved by the strange new environment, began to lose their resolve. The rivers grew larger, the rain fell ceaselessly, and the stories of the Nanda's elephants filled them with dread. Even Alexander's unshakable ambition could not overcome the fatigue of his men. At the banks of the Bees River, known to the Greeks as the Hyphasis, the army refused to march further. Alexander convened a council of his generals, urging them to continue. He spoke of glory, of the wealth that awaited them beyond the Ganges, of his desire to reach the ocean and circle back to Persia through Arabia. But the army was unmoved. They had seen enough of India's vastness and its might. The decision was unanimous. They would go no farther east. The great conqueror, who had never before turned back, was forced to yield to his men's will. Thus, the shadow of the Nandas, though they never directly faced Alexander in battle, played a decisive role in halting his campaign. The empire of Magadha, vast and well defended, stood as an invisible barrier between the Macedonian army and the deeper heart of India. To the Greeks, it became a symbol of unconquerable wealth and power. To the Indians, it marked the limit of foreign intrusion for a generation. After his retreat from the Bees, Alexander turned southward, following the Indus River toward the Arabian Sea. Along the way, he faced fierce resistance from local tribes such as the Malians, suffering wounds that nearly claimed his life. His forces split into separate columns, one marching by land through the harsh Gedrosian desert, the other sailing along the coast under his admiral Nearchus. The journey back was a trial of endurance, and many soldiers perished before reaching the safety of Persian-held territory. Though Alexander's presence in India lasted barely 2 years, its effects were enduring. His campaign established the first direct contact between the Greek world and India, opening routes for trade, diplomacy, and the exchange of ideas. Greek cities and colonies sprouted in the frontier regions of Bactria and Gandhara, where they blended Hellenistic and Indian cultures. Philosophers, merchants, and artisans began to move between these worlds, creating a dialogue that would shape the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. For the Nandas, the Macedonian invasion was both distant and immediate. Though Alexander never reached their borders, his conquest of the Indus Valley brought foreign armies within striking distance of the Gangetic Plains for the first time. The Nanda court at Pataliputra must have followed these developments with keen attention. Their spies and diplomats would have relayed news of battles, alliances, and troop movements. The Nanda kings, secure behind their armies and rivers, likely prepared for the possibility of confrontation even as they celebrated their reputation for invincibility. The indirect encounter between Alexander and the Nandas also highlights the contrast between two models of empire. Alexander's dominion was personal, built through charisma and conquest, stretching thin across vast territories that depended on his presence. The Nanda Empire, by contrast, was institutional, a machine of taxation, administration, and logistics capable of sustaining itself regardless of the ruler's personality. Where Alexander's power faded after his death, the Nanda system endured, its strength embedded in its bureaucracy and economy. In the aftermath of Alexander's withdrawal, his successors, the Diadochi, struggled to control his fragmented empire. In the northwest of India, his general Seleucus eventually established the Seleucid Empire, which maintained tenuous influence over the Indus regions. But beyond the frontier, the Magadhan realm remained untouched, its strength undiminished. The Nandas continued to rule, their armies untested by foreign invasion yet increasingly burdened by internal strains. Greek writers who later described India under the Mauryas often echoed the stories first told during Alexander's campaign. They spoke of enormous cities, disciplined armies, and rulers of immense wealth, images rooted in the legends of the Nanda Empire. To them, India was a land both mysterious and formidable, defined by the power of kings who ruled over countless subjects and commanded beasts of war unlike any in the West. The encounter between Alexander's world and the Nanda's world marked a turning point in history. It signaled the beginning of a new era of connectivity between East and West, yet it also demonstrated the resilience of Indian civilization in the face of external challenge. The Macedonian retreat preserved the autonomy of the subcontinent's heartland, allowing the indigenous empires of Magadha to evolve without foreign domination. For the Nandas themselves, the news of Alexander's death a few years later in Babylon must have confirmed their sense of invulnerability. The great conqueror who had threatened the world was gone, and Magadha stood unscathed. Yet, ironically, it was within their own empire, not from foreign invaders, that their greatest challenge would soon arise. The death of Mahapadma Nanda marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Nanda Empire. The king who had seized power, built an enormous army, filled his treasuries, and governed through an efficient bureaucracy left behind not only a vast dominion but also a delicate structure of control. The stability of the Nanda realm had depended on the vision and authority of one man, and with his passing, the question of succession loomed large. How would this empire, so heavily centralized and dependent on the will of its founder, endure under his heirs? Ancient sources differ on how many successors Mahapadma left. Some traditions speak of 8 sons, each ruling for a short time before the throne finally passed to Dana Nanda, the last and most famous of the dynasty. Other accounts suggest a smoother transition, with Dana Nanda inheriting power directly as the designated heir. Regardless of the exact sequence, what is certain is that the unity and discipline that had characterized Mahapadma's rule began to erode after his death. The empire remained wealthy and formidable, but cracks were appearing beneath the surface. The first challenge for the Nanda successors was legitimacy. Mahapadma's authority had rested on personal charisma, administrative skill, and the sheer weight of success. He had been the architect of conquest and consolidation, the man who turned Magadha into the heart of India's first great empire. His heirs, however, inherited his power, but not his prestige. They faced the difficult task of ruling a complex and bureaucratic state without the aura of the founder. The second challenge was the empire's scale. The Nanda realm stretched from the eastern seaboard to the borders of the Punjab, encompassing dozens of regions and cultures. Governing such an expanse required constant attention, communication, and coordination. Under Mahapadma's firm hand, the bureaucracy had functioned with precision. Under his successors, it became more vulnerable to corruption and factionalism. Provincial governors, entrusted with immense responsibilities, began to act more independently, while ambitious generals and ministers at court competed for influence. Economic pressures compounded these political strains. The Nanda state's prosperity depended on the steady extraction of taxes from its agricultural heartlands and on the revenue from trade and industry. The costs of maintaining a massive standing army and a sprawling administration were immense. To keep the system running, the successors of Mahapadma had little choice but to continue heavy taxation. This burden fell hardest on farmers and artisans, who now faced demands that seemed less justifiable under rulers whose achievements were less visible than those of their father. Buddhist and Jain texts, written in later centuries but reflecting earlier traditions, portray the Nandas after Mahapadma as increasingly unpopular. The image of Dana Nanda in particular is that of a ruler both immensely rich and deeply resented, a king who inherited his father's empire but not his restraint. According to these sources, he was known for his arrogance, his greed, and his disregard for the moral order. Though these accounts may exaggerate for dramatic effect, they capture an essential truth. By the time of Nanda, the relationship between the Nanda rulers and their subjects had begun to deteriorate. In many ways, this was a consequence of the very success of the Nanda system. Mahapadma had centralized power so completely that the monarchy's legitimacy depended almost entirely on its ability to maintain order and prosperity. Once either faltered, there was no traditional or religious foundation strong enough to sustain loyalty. The older dynasties had claimed divine descent. The Nandas claimed efficiency. When efficiency gave way to oppression, their moral claim to rule weakened rapidly. Within the royal court, intrigue and rivalry became increasingly common. The vast wealth accumulated in the treasury of Pataliputra, instead of serving as a symbol of strength, became a source of temptation and contention. Ministers and courtiers vied for royal favor, while distant provinces watched closely for signs of weakness. The very bureaucracy that had ensured stability under Mahapadma now became a labyrinth of competing interests. Yet, despite these internal tensions, the Nanda Empire remained outwardly strong. Its armies were still vast, its fortresses intact, its economy productive. Foreign observers, such as the Greek chroniclers who heard of India through the remnants of Alexander's campaign, continued to describe the Nanda realm as the richest and most powerful in the East. But inside the empire, discontent was growing. The heavy hand of taxation, the perceived arrogance of the ruling elite, and the exclusion of traditional noble families from power all fueled resentment among both elites and commoners. One of the most striking features of this period was the alienation of the Brahmanical class. The Nandas, following Mahapadma's pragmatic approach, had relied more on administrators and financiers than on priests and nobles. While this policy had strengthened the crown, it had also alienated those who had once legitimized kings through ritual. Brahmins who lost their privileges found new ways to express dissent through stories, texts, and teachings that condemned greed and tyranny. In these narratives, Nanda became a symbol of unrighteous kingship, a warning against rulers who placed wealth above virtue. The intellectual climate of India during this time was also changing. The rise of Buddhism, Jainism, and other heterodox traditions had introduced new moral standards by which rulers were judged. The idea of the Dharmaraja, the righteous king who ruled through justice rather than fear, was gaining prominence. Against this backdrop, the Nanda style of authoritarian and wealth-driven rule seemed increasingly out of step with the moral expectations of the age. Yet, for all the criticism, the Nandas maintained their grip on power for several decades after Mahapadma's death. Their control over the core of Magadha remained unshaken, and their military might deterred both internal revolts and external invasions. The problem was not immediate collapse but gradual stagnation. The energy of conquest and reform that had characterized Mahapadma's reign gave way to inertia. The empire functioned, but without innovation or vision. It was during this period of complacent strength that new forces began to gather at the margins. In the northwest, the withdrawal of Alexander's armies had left behind fragmented territories ruled by Greek and local satraps. These borderlands became zones of opportunity for ambitious leaders who sought to unite India once more. Among them was a young man from the region of Gandhara, or Punjab, Chandragupta Maurya, who would soon rise to challenge the Nandas. According to later accounts, Chandragupta's rebellion was guided by a brilliant and vengeful strategist named Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta. Chanakya, a scholar and political thinker, had once visited the Nanda court, but was allegedly insulted and humiliated by Nanda. Swearing revenge, he vowed to overthrow the dynasty and replace it with a new order. Though the story may contain elements of legend, it captures a real dynamic. Resentment among dispossessed elites and intellectuals was reaching a breaking point. Nanda, despite his unflattering reputation, was not a weak ruler in the administrative sense. He controlled one of the largest and most organized states in the ancient world. but his rule suffered from a failure of perception. Where his father had built legitimacy through achievement, Nanda relied on inherited power and the machinery of control. The bureaucracy that once symbolized order now appeared as an instrument of oppression. The wealth that once inspired respect now provoked envy and anger. The empire's outer provinces, far from Pataliputra, began to drift toward autonomy. Governors who felt neglected or overtaxed asserted greater independence. Trade routes that once carried tribute to the capital started to fragment. Meanwhile, rumors of rebellion and conspiracy circulated among the people. Though open revolt was rare, the moral authority of the dynasty was quietly crumbling. This period of decline was not marked by dramatic events, but by a gradual erosion of confidence, a subtle unraveling of the bond between ruler and realm. The Nanda Empire, though still formidable on paper, was becoming brittle. The stage was being set for a dramatic upheaval, one that would bring together discontented elites, restless soldiers, and ambitious leaders under a new banner. By the time Nanda ascended the throne of Magadha, the empire stood at the peak of its territorial extent and material prosperity. The mighty treasury at Pataliputra overflowed with gold, silver, and grain. The army numbered in hundreds of thousands, and the Nanda name inspired awe across India. Yet behind this glittering facade lay a realm weighed down by overextension, discontent, and moral fatigue. Nanda inherited not only the wealth and systems of his father, but also the burdens that came with them: a rigid bureaucracy, a restless populace, and a fragile legitimacy. His reign would be both a demonstration of absolute power and a lesson in the limits of authority built on fear and wealth. Nanda's accession was not marked by civil war or chaos. The machinery of the Nanda state functioned too smoothly to allow open disruption. But from the moment he took power, he faced a dilemma that his predecessors had never fully resolved: how to reconcile the authority of an all-powerful monarchy with the moral and social expectations of a changing India. The empire's stability depended on the obedience of its administrators and subjects, yet obedience rooted in coercion alone could not endure indefinitely. Ancient traditions paint Nanda in dark colors. In Buddhist and Jain sources, he appears as a ruler consumed by greed, vanity, and pride. He is described as a man who taxed his people heavily, humiliated his courtiers, and hoarded wealth on an almost unimaginable scale. The Brahmanical Puranas likewise portray him as impious and arrogant, a king whose reign symbolized the degeneration of royal virtue. These depictions, while certainly shaped by later moral and political agendas, hint at the widespread dissatisfaction that marked his rule. What made Nanda so unpopular was not simply his wealth, but his relationship to it. The Nanda dynasty's power rested on the accumulation and control of resources. For Mahapadma, wealth had been a tool, a means to expand the empire and secure its institutions. For Nanda, it became an end in itself. The royal treasury, instead of serving the realm, began to dominate it. Taxation, already heavy, was intensified. Revenue collectors scoured the countryside for every possible source of income. Merchants, artisans, and farmers alike felt the reach of the state's fiscal demands. This relentless extraction produced results. The treasury swelled, but the people's loyalty shrank. Popular stories from later centuries tell of secret vaults beneath the palace at Pataliputra filled with untold riches, guarded day and night by soldiers and trusted officials. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales capture an essential truth about Nanda's rule. His power was immense, but increasingly isolated. The king lived behind walls of wealth and suspicion, disconnected from the moral pulse of his kingdom. Nanda's temperament also alienated many of the elites who had once supported his father. The Brahmins, long estranged from royal favor, found no reconciliation under his rule. The merchants, who had prospered under Nanda protection, now resented the growing burden of taxation. Even within the bureaucracy, resentment brewed. Governors and officials, exhausted by the constant pressure to extract revenue, began to question the justice of their orders. The loyalty of the empire's administrators, once sustained by efficiency and reward, started to waver. The Nanda army, though still formidable, had also become a double-edged sword. Its vast size demanded enormous maintenance costs, and its officers held significant influence. Nanda's suspicion of rivals led him to impose strict control over his generals, rewarding loyalty but punishing ambition. While this kept the army obedient, it also stifled initiative. The disciplined war machine built by Mahapadma became increasingly rigid, a weapon that could defend but not inspire. Culturally, Nanda ruled in an era of profound intellectual and spiritual ferment. The teachings of the Buddha and Mahavira had spread across the Ganges Valley, challenging traditional notions of caste, power, and wealth. The new religious movements emphasized simplicity, ethical conduct, and compassion, values that stood in stark contrast to the ostentatious splendor of the Nanda court. Monks and teachers, supported by merchants and commoners, quietly criticized the excesses of the state. Their message resonated with those who felt oppressed by the weight of taxation and hierarchy. At the same time, Brahmanical scholars and priests, though critical of the heterodox sects, found common cause in condemning Nanda's irreverence towards sacred authority. The result was a rare convergence of moral opposition across social and religious boundaries. For different reasons, both traditionalists and reformers saw the Nanda king as a symbol of corruption and decline. Yet Nanda was not without ability. He maintained the empire's borders, managed its administration, and continued to project power across the subcontinent. Foreign observers, particularly Greek writers who received reports from travelers and traders, continued to describe Magadha as a kingdom of extraordinary wealth and organization. The Nanda capital remained a marvel of architecture and urban life, its streets crowded with merchants, soldiers, and officials. The empire functioned, but its energy was increasingly hollow, driven by inertia rather than inspiration. It was during Nanda's reign that one of the most fateful encounters in Indian history took place. The meeting of Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, with the Nanda court. According to later traditions, Chanakya was a Brahmin scholar from Takshashila, a renowned center of learning in the northwest. He is said to have come to Pataliputra seeking royal patronage or political reform, but was insulted by the arrogant king. Some accounts claim that Nanda mocked Chanakya's appearance or dismissed him as a mere scholar unworthy of attention. Enraged, Chanakya swore an oath to overthrow the Nandas and replace them with a new dynasty. Whether this story is legend or fact, it encapsulates the growing divide between the ruling elite and the intellectual class. The Nanda court, confident in its material strength, failed to recognize the shifting moral and political currents of the time. The disdain shown to a figure like Chanakya symbolized the empire's blindness to the discontent simmering beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in the northwest, the political vacuum left by Alexander's departure created opportunities for ambitious leaders. Among them was Chandragupta Maurya, a young man of striking ability and vision. According to tradition, Chanakya discovered Chandragupta's potential and took him under his guidance, training him in statecraft, strategy, and warfare. Together, they began to organize resistance against Nanda rule, first in the frontier regions and later in the heartland itself. As Chandragupta gathered supporters, disaffected generals, provincial governors, and local rulers weary of Nanda dominance, the empire's vulnerabilities became clear. Nanda's control over his outer provinces had weakened, and his reliance on coercion rather than loyalty left him exposed to rebellion. The bureaucratic efficiency that had once unified the realm now made it inflexible, unable to adapt to sudden challenges. Nanda's attempts to suppress dissent were harsh and often counterproductive. Rebels were punished severely, taxes were raised to fund new campaigns, and the capital grew increasingly insulated from the provinces. Reports of unrest reached Pataliputra, but the king, confident in his wealth and the size of his army, dismissed them as minor disturbances. His arrogance, born of long unchallenged power, blinded him to the gathering storm. In time, Chandragupta and Chanakya's movement evolved from rebellion to revolution. They built alliances across regions, combining military strength with political strategy. Their message of liberation from tyranny and restoration of just governance resonated deeply with those disillusioned by Nanda rule. The precise sequence of events remains uncertain, but the pattern is clear. The Nanda's centralized empire, once the symbol of Indian power, began to crumble from within. Nanda's downfall was not sudden, but inevitable. The same instruments of control that had secured the dynasty's success became its undoing. Heavy taxation alienated the people, centralization stifled local initiative, and wealth bred complacency at the top. The empire's foundation of fear and obedience could not withstand a coordinated challenge fueled by moral conviction and strategic acumen. When the final confrontation came, likely in or near Pataliputra, it was as much a battle of legitimacy as of arms. Chandragupta's forces, inspired by Chanakya's vision, represented a new kind of statecraft, disciplined, ideological, and reformist. The Nandas, weighed down by corruption and isolation, could not resist the tide. According to later sources, Nanda was either killed in battle or allowed to leave with his wealth into exile. Whatever the precise details, his fall marked the end of a dynasty that had once ruled almost all of northern India. Nanda's reign, though vilified in later memory, was pivotal in India's political evolution. He embodied both the heights and the perils of absolute power, the culmination of a system that valued administration and wealth above moral legitimacy. His excesses paved the way for a new order, one that sought to balance authority with ethics, pragmatism with purpose. As the reign of Nanda entered its later years, the vast empire of Magadha seemed unassailable. The royal treasury at Pataliputra overflowed with riches. The army remained one of the largest in the ancient world, and the machinery of administration functioned with cold precision. Yet, beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The people of the Ganges plain, weary of taxation and the arrogance of officials, began to murmur of injustice. Provincial governors complained of excessive central interference, and the Brahmanical elites whispered of a king who had forsaken sacred order. The Nanda dynasty, for all its power, was increasingly isolated from the moral and emotional life of its realm. It was in this climate of quiet discontent that two figures emerged whose partnership would alter the course of Indian history: Chanakya, the strategist and philosopher, and Chandragupta Maurya, the young warrior destined to overthrow the Nandas. The story of their meeting has been told and retold in legend, but behind the embellishment lies a profound political truth. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta, is believed to have come from Takshashila, the great center of learning in the northwest. He was a scholar of extraordinary intellect, versed in philosophy, economics, and political science. Takshashila at this time was a crossroads of cultures. Greek, Persian, and Indian influences mingled there, shaping the minds of thinkers and administrators who served in courts across the subcontinent. From this world of ideas, Chanakya brought not only knowledge, but also a deep understanding of how power functioned in practice. According to traditional accounts preserved in Buddhist, Jain, and Sanskrit sources, Chanakya arrived at the Nanda court seeking royal favor or employment. Some versions suggest he hoped to offer advice on governance, while others claim he came to secure resources for the defense of the Northwest. Whatever his purpose, his reception at Pataliputra was disastrous. Nanda, known for his arrogance, reportedly mocked the scholar's appearance and dismissed him in humiliation. Enraged, Chanakya vowed to uproot the Nanda dynasty and replace it with a ruler worthy of India's destiny. Whether or not the insult occurred exactly as the legends describe, it symbolized a real and widening divide between an entrenched, self-satisfied monarchy and a new generation of thinkers who sought reform and renewal. In his quest to overthrow the Nandas, Chanakya turned to the one force that could challenge their power, a coalition drawn from the empire's discontented peripheries. Traveling westward, He found fertile ground in the regions recently touched by the Macedonian invasion. The northwestern territories were in flux. Greek satraps ruled some cities, local rulers others, and the people had grown weary of foreign interference. Amid this turbulence, Chanakya encountered a young man of striking intelligence and ambition, Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta's origins remain uncertain. Some traditions describe him as a scion of a minor royal house displaced by the Nandas, others as a man of humble birth who rose through sheer ability. What is clear is that he possessed charisma, courage, and an intuitive grasp of leadership. Under Chanakya's mentorship, he received rigorous training in statecraft, strategy, and warfare. The relationship between the two was one of mind and action. Chanakya provided vision and planning. Chandragupta supplied energy and execution. Together, they embodied a fusion of intellect and ambition that would shake the foundations of empire. Their early efforts were cautious. A direct assault on the Nandas, protected by their immense army and wealth, was impossible. Instead, Chanakya adopted a strategy of gradual encirclement. He encouraged rebellion in the outer provinces, building alliances among regional rulers who resented Magadhan domination. The northwest, still unsettled after Alexander's withdrawal, became the first theater of their activity. Here, Chandragupta gathered troops, won over local chieftains, and learned the art of command through small campaigns. The presence of Greek and Persian influences in this region may have played a subtle but significant role in shaping the tactics of the Mauryan revolution. Chanakya, familiar with foreign models of governance, understood that empire could not be toppled by brute force alone. It required organization, espionage, and diplomacy. Drawing on the intellectual traditions of Takshashila and his own observations of the Nanda bureaucracy, he began to formulate the principles that would later be codified in the Arthashastra, a treatise on politics and administration that remains one of the most sophisticated works of ancient statecraft. Step by step, the insurgency gathered strength. Chandragupta's early ventures met with mixed results. Some sources mention defeats that forced him into temporary exile, but persistence paid off. With Chanakya's guidance, he built an army loyal not to provincial interests, but to a shared vision of unity and justice. Disaffected generals from the Nanda ranks, attracted by promises of reform and reward, began to defect. Merchants frustrated by oppressive taxation provided financial backing. Even sections of the Brahmanical elite, alienated by Dhanananda's irreverence, lent moral support to the cause. Chanakya's genius lay in his ability to transform grievance into strategy. He recognized that revolutions succeed not merely through outrage, but through calculation. The Nanda Empire, though mighty, was rigid. Its strength lay in numbers and wealth, not in flexibility or loyalty. By exploiting its weaknesses, over-centralization, corruption, and fear, Chanakya sought to erode the Nanda's authority from within before confronting them openly. Meanwhile, Chandragupta proved himself a natural commander. Accounts describe him as tall, fearless, and persuasive, a leader capable of inspiring both soldiers and statesmen. His campaigns across the Northwest not only expanded his military experience, but also demonstrated his capacity to unite diverse peoples under a single command. The lessons he learned in diplomacy and warfare during these years would later serve him well as emperor. The alliance between teacher and pupil was not merely tactical, it was ideological. Chanakya envisioned a new form of kingship, one that combined moral purpose with administrative discipline. He taught that a ruler's duty was not to personal pleasure or dynastic pride, but to the stability and prosperity of the state. This philosophy, though pragmatic, had a moral core. Order and justice were inseparable. The excesses of the Nandas, who ruled by fear and taxation, stood as the negative example against which the new order defined itself. As Chandragupta's power grew, so did the anxiety in Pataliputra. Dhanananda, surrounded by flatterers and insulated by wealth, dismissed reports of rebellion as minor disturbances. His ministers assured him that the imperial army could crush any uprising. But the rebels were no ordinary insurgents. They were led by one of the most brilliant strategists of the age and supported by a coalition of forces united by a common cause. When the conflict finally came to the heartland of Magadha, it was not a single decisive battle, but a series of campaigns that gradually tightened the noose around the capital. Chanakya's spies infiltrated the Nanda administration, sowing confusion and mistrust. Provincial garrisons, demoralized by years of overtaxation and harsh command, defected to Chandragupta's side. Step by step, the invincible empire began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. During these campaigns, Chanakya's strategic brilliance shone in full. He emphasized intelligence over brute strength, deception over direct confrontation. Fortresses were taken through infiltration rather than siege. Supply lines were cut, alliances fractured, and morale undermined. The Nanda generals, accustomed to traditional warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. As the rebellion spread, the moral dimension of the conflict became increasingly clear. To many in the Ganges Valley, Chandragupta and Chanakya represented not merely a military challenge to the Nandas, but a moral reckoning. They promised a return to justice, moderation, and rational governance. Their campaign, though ruthless at times, carried the language of restoration rather than mere conquest. The final approach to Pataliputra was both a military and psychological siege. The city, defended by high walls and rivers, was difficult to penetrate, but within its confines, loyalty was crumbling. Officials hesitated to act without clear orders, fearing the wrath of both king and rebels. Merchants, remembering years of oppressive taxation, quietly aided the besiegers. The once mighty Nanda court, rich in gold but poor in allies, stood increasingly alone. At last, the capital fell. The details of Dhanananda's fate differ across sources. Some say he was killed in battle, others that he was captured and allowed to depart into exile with his treasure. What remains certain is that the Nanda dynasty, which had ruled Magadha with unprecedented power and wealth, came to an end. In its place rose the Mauryan dynasty, founded by Chandragupta under the counsel of Chanakya, a dynasty that would soon surpass even the Nandas in reach and longevity. The revolution that overthrew the Nandas was not merely a change of rulers, it was a transformation of political philosophy. It replaced an empire of wealth with an empire of order, a system driven by greed with one guided by purpose. The lessons of the Nanda collapse were absorbed into the very foundations of the Mauryan state. The new rulers retained the administrative machinery, the fiscal systems, and the disciplined army of their predecessors, but they infused them with a new legitimacy based on justice and vision. The fall of the Nanda dynasty was not a single cataclysmic event, but a culmination of years of pressure, planning, and precise execution. By the time Chandragupta Maurya and Chanakya turned their sights toward Pataliputra, the Nanda Empire had already begun to crumble from within. The administrative structure remained imposing, the army vast, and the treasury overflowing. But the spirit that had once animated the empire was gone. What remained was a hollow power, formidable in appearance but fragile at its core. The campaigns that led to the Nanda's overthrow revealed this fragility with ruthless clarity. After years of preparation in the northwest, Chandragupta and Chanakya had forged a coalition strong enough to challenge the imperial might of Magadha. Their early strategy had focused on securing the frontier regions, winning over smaller states and tribal communities that had long resented Nanda domination. These peripheral victories were not only military but psychological. Each success demonstrated that the Nanda army, once thought invincible, could indeed be defeated. The rebels moved gradually, building momentum as provinces and towns began to shift allegiance. Chanakya's approach to the final campaign was methodical. Drawing on his deep understanding of political science and human behavior, he recognized that the fall of an empire depended as much on disaffection as on direct confrontation. The Nanda state, with its rigid centralization, offered many points of weakness. Provincial governors chafed under excessive oversight. Merchants resented constant taxation, Priests and intellectuals lamented the king's irreverence, and the common people bore the weight of endless levies. Chanakya turned these grievances into weapons. Through spies, agents, and emissaries, he spread messages of revolt, convincing disillusioned officials that the Nanda age was ending. Chandragupta's forces, trained and disciplined, advanced from the northwest into the Ganges Valley. The campaigns were swift and decisive. Town after town fell not because of overwhelming force, but because local populations opened their gates. The rebellion was no longer a distant rumor. It had become a movement. In several instances, Nanda garrisons surrendered without resistance, their commanders unwilling to sacrifice their lives for a king they no longer respected. The military advantage the Nandas had once enjoyed, numbers, elephants, and fortifications, was undermined by the erosion of loyalty within their ranks. As Chandragupta advanced, Chanakya coordinated the flow of intelligence from inside Pataliputra. His network of spies, operating in the capital's markets, temples, and even the royal palace, provided continuous updates on the mood of the court. The reports were grim for Nanda. His ministers quarreled, his generals mistrusted one another, and the treasury, though full, could no longer buy loyalty. The more gold he distributed to secure allegiance, the less trustworthy his supporters became. The empire's wealth, once a source of stability, now fueled intrigue and betrayal. The first major confrontation between Chandragupta's army and the Nanda forces took place near the outer reaches of Magadha's territory. While exact locations are lost to time, the accounts suggest a series of engagements along the plains west of the capital. The Nanda army, though larger, was unwieldy. Its commanders, appointed through favor rather than merit, lacked coordination. Chandragupta's troops, trained in mobile warfare and guided by Chanakya's strategy, exploited this weakness. They struck swiftly at supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and avoided pitched battles until the enemy's morale was thoroughly shaken. One of Chanakya's most effective tactics was deception. He understood that empires often fall not through sheer destruction but through the illusion of inevitability. Rumors were deliberately spread that Chandragupta had divine sanction, that prophecies foretold the end of the Nandas, and that rebellion was sweeping across the land. Such psychological warfare had a devastating effect on morale. Soldiers began to question whether they were fighting for a doomed cause, while local rulers hesitated to commit to the Nanda side. The authority of Nanda, once absolute, began to dissolve into doubt. As Chandragupta's army approached Pataliputra, the city braced for siege. The capital, surrounded by rivers and protected by fortified walls, was one of the most secure strongholds in ancient India. It had withstood past threats and was considered nearly impregnable. Nanda gathered his remaining forces, recalling troops from across the empire. The defense of Pataliputra would be the ultimate test of the Nanda system, a battle between the inertia of old power and the energy of new ambition. Chanakya, however, had no intention of relying solely on brute force. His plan was as much political as military. Even before the siege began, he worked to ensure that the city's defenses were undermined from within. Agents infiltrated the bureaucracy, bribing or persuading key officials to delay orders, misdirect supplies, or open secret channels of communication with the besiegers. Merchants, angered by years of exploitation, supplied provisions to Chandragupta's camp. The blockade around the city tightened, and the once mighty capital found itself isolated. The siege of Pataliputra lasted for months. Within the walls, food shortages began to bite. Panic spread among the population, and whispers of surrender circulated even among the officers. Nanda, however, refused to yield. His pride, inflamed by years of absolute rule, would not allow compromise. He relied on the strength of his fortifications and the size of his treasury, convinced that gold could still buy salvation. Yet gold could not feed soldiers or inspire faith. Each day that passed eroded both. Outside the walls, Chandragupta's army maintained relentless pressure. Supply lines were cut, reinforcements intercepted, and escape routes blocked. Chanakya coordinated every move with precision, ensuring that the siege combined psychological attrition with military control. His goal was not to destroy the city, but to make resistance impossible. As famine and fatigue took hold, defections began. Commanders once loyal to Nanda opened secret negotiations, offering to surrender in exchange for safety. The final stage came not through a single decisive battle, but through collapse from within. Accounts differ on whether the city was stormed or surrendered, but all agree that the end came swiftly once the internal defenses failed. The gates were opened, perhaps by traitors, perhaps by citizens desperate to end their suffering, and Chandragupta's forces entered Pataliputra. What followed marked one of the most remarkable transitions of power in Indian history. Despite the bitterness of the struggle, the conquest was not followed by widespread destruction. Chanakya's strategy was to seize the apparatus of state intact. The bureaucracy, the treasury, and even the administrative records were preserved. Many officials who had served the Nandas continued under the new regime, ensuring continuity of governance. In this sense, the fall of the Nandas was not the collapse of an empire, but its transformation. Dhanananda's fate remains a subject of legend. Some traditions claim he was killed in battle. Others suggest that Chandragupta, guided by Chanakya's counsel, allowed him to depart with his wealth into exile. The latter account aligns with the pragmatic spirit of the new rulers. The goal was not vengeance, but reconstruction. The Mauryan revolution, though born of rebellion, sought stability above all. When Chandragupta finally ascended the throne of Magadha, likely in the mid-4th century BCE, the event marked the dawn of a new era. The Nanda Empire, for all its flaws, had provided the foundation for this achievement. Its systems of taxation, administration, and military organization were inherited and refined by the Mauryas. The difference lay in the moral and ideological framework. Where the Nandas had ruled through wealth and coercion, the Mauryas would seek to rule through legitimacy and law. The conquest of Pataliputra also symbolized the triumph of intellect over inertia. Chanakya's strategy demonstrated that empires could be defeated not merely by strength of arms, but by understanding human nature, by recognizing that power without respect is brittle, that fear without justice breeds rebellion, and that governance without adaptability invites downfall. His role in shaping the transition from Nanda to Maurya remains one of the most profound examples of political statecraft in world history. For the people of Magadha, the change brought both relief and renewal. The oppressive taxation and rigid hierarchy of the late Nanda era gave way, at least initially, to reforms aimed at fairness and stability. The new rulers promised to restore moral order, balance wealth with welfare, and govern according to Dharma, the principle of righteousness and responsibility. The energy of revolution thus transformed into the discipline of empire. The overthrow of the Nandas was more than a dynastic change. It was the birth of a new conception of power. The Mauryan Empire that emerged from the ruins of the Nanda regime would soon expand beyond anything Mahapadma could have imagined, stretching from the Himalayas to the Deccan and from the Indus to the Bay of Bengal. But its success rested on lessons learned from the Nandas, lessons about the dangers of arrogance, the fragility of centralized control, and the need for legitimacy rooted in both prosperity and justice. In the aftermath of the conquest, Chanakya is said to have composed the Arthashastra, codifying the principles of governance that had guided the revolution. Whether written during his lifetime or later, the text captures the essence of this turning point. The idea that a ruler's power depends not only on force or wealth, but on the intelligent management of both. In that sense, the fall of the Nandas was not merely an end, but a foundation, a necessary clearing of the old order to make way for a more enduring vision of statecraft. The fall of the Nanda dynasty did not bring an end to empire in India. It marked its transformation. When Chandragupta Maurya ascended the throne of Magadha, guided by the intellect and foresight of Chanakya, he inherited more than a conquered territory. He inherited the institutions, systems, and lessons forged by the Nandas. The dynasty that had once ruled through wealth and discipline had laid the structural foundations upon which the Mauryas would build one of the greatest empires in Indian and world history. The Nandas had created the blueprint of imperial governance. The Mauryas perfected it. The transition from Nanda to Maurya was remarkably smooth, given the scale of upheaval that preceded it. Chanakya's strategy of preserving the administrative machinery during the conquest ensured that the empire did not collapse into chaos. The bureaucracy, the tax systems, the army, and even much of the provincial structure remained intact. What changed was not the machinery itself, but the philosophy that drove it. The Nandas had used these systems to extract and control. The Mauryas would use them to organize and unify. Chandragupta's first task as ruler was consolidation. Though the Nanda strongholds had been captured, vast territories still required pacification. Some provincial governors had declared neutrality during the conflict and now sought autonomy. Chanakya moved swiftly to reassert central authority, using both diplomacy and force. The loyalty of the provinces was secured through a combination of rewards and administrative reform. Governors were appointed not as hereditary nobles, but as salaried officers answerable directly to the throne. This policy, echoing Mahapadmananda's original vision but refined through experience, ensured that loyalty flowed to the emperor rather than to local interests. Economically, Chandragupta continued many of the Nanda fiscal practices, but under more regulated and ethical supervision. Taxation remained systematic but was balanced by state investment in infrastructure and welfare. The treasury that the Nandas had amassed became the financial engine of early Mauryan expansion. Chanakya's economic principles, later enshrined in the Arthashastra, drew directly from the administrative precedents of the Nanda era, but reoriented them toward stability and justice. The emphasis shifted from accumulation to efficiency, from hoarding wealth to using it strategically for public works, defense, and diplomacy. The Mauryan capital at Pataliputra retained much of its Nanda grandeur. Greek and later accounts described it as one of the largest cities in the world, fortified, prosperous, and meticulously organized. Its wide avenues, wooden palisades, and grand halls had been constructed under the Nandas, who had turned the city into a model of imperial administration. Under Chandragupta, Pataliputra became not only the seat of government but also the center of a new vision of empire, one grounded in law, rational governance, and moral legitimacy. The new dynasty also benefited from the global circumstances that followed Alexander's death. The Macedonian Empire fragmented into successor states, including the Seleucid Empire, which controlled Persia and parts of the northwestern subcontinent. Chandragupta's early campaigns extended Mauryan control over these frontier regions, incorporating territories that had once been Achaemenid satrapies. In this process, the Mauryan state directly inherited the Indo-Persian administrative traditions that the Nandas had only known indirectly through trade and influence. The fusion of Nanda efficiency with Persian models of provincial governance produced a system of unprecedented sophistication. Diplomatically, Chandragupta's reign was defined by stability. His treaty with Seleucus Nicator, the founder of the Seleucid Empire, established clear borders and open channels of exchange between India and the Hellenistic world. This agreement not only confirmed Mauryan strength, but also reinforced India's position as a major power in the post-Achaemenid landscape. The elephants exchanged as part of the treaty would later become famous in Greek accounts, symbolizing the continuity of the Nanda military legacy in Mauryan service. Under Chandragupta and Chanakya, the moral tone of governance also shifted. The lessons of the Nanda downfall were fresh in the minds of the new rulers. Arrogance, greed, and alienation of the populace were seen as fatal errors. Chanakya's Arthashastra articulated this philosophy clearly. A ruler's duty was to ensure the welfare of his people, for their prosperity was the foundation of his own power. The king was advised to act not as a despot, but as a steward, bound by dharma, the principle of righteous conduct. This moral and administrative balance became the cornerstone of the Mauryan state and distinguished it from its predecessor. The Mauryas also expanded the role of law and surveillance that had been initiated under the Nandas. The Nandas had relied heavily on spies and informants to maintain control, a practice Chanakya retained but refined. In the Mauryan system, espionage was institutionalized as part of governance, designed not merely to detect rebellion but to ensure accountability among officials. The network of information that once sustained Nanda despotism was transformed into an instrument of administrative vigilance. Culturally and ideologically, the shift from Nanda to Maurya represented the maturation of Indian kingship. The Nandas had proven that large-scale empire was possible in India, but their rule had been pragmatic rather than philosophical. The Mauryas added a deeper moral and intellectual foundation. Under their reign, statecraft was not only a means of control, but an ethical enterprise, balancing material strength with moral legitimacy. This transformation reflected the intellectual climate of the age, where Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical thinkers alike debated the nature of justice, duty, and the purpose of power. Chandragupta's own life after his abdication illustrates this synthesis of politics and spirituality. According to Jain tradition, he renounced his throne and became an ascetic, seeking liberation through renunciation in southern India. Whether this account is literal or symbolic, it captures a larger truth. The Mauryan conception of kingship was deeply intertwined with moral introspection. The empire's strength was grounded not only in armies and taxes, but in a vision of righteous governance, a vision born from the mistakes of the Nandas. The legacy of the Nanda Empire thus persisted in multiple dimensions. Politically, their administrative and fiscal systems became the foundation upon which all subsequent Indian empires were built. Economically, their emphasis on centralized revenue collection and state control of resources established the model for imperial finance. Culturally, their rise from modest origins to imperial power challenged the old hierarchies of caste and lineage, demonstrating that ability and ambition could shape destiny as powerfully as birth. Even in decline, the Nandas left a mark on the imagination of India. In later literature, they were portrayed variously as tyrants, innovators, or symbols of impermanence. Buddhist texts remembered them as greedy and oppressive, while Jain traditions viewed their fall as a moral reckoning. Yet, in every account, the Nandas remained pivotal, a dynasty whose rise and fall defined the transition from ancient kingdoms to the age of empire. The continuity between Nanda and Maurya governance is evident in the administrative ethos that endured for centuries afterward. The emphasis on efficient record-keeping, standardized taxation, professional armies, and centralized bureaucracy, all hallmarks of later Indian empires, originated in the Nanda experience. The Mauryas refined these features, but they did not invent them. In this sense, the Nandas were the true pioneers of empire building in India. The moral of their story, however, is one of balance. The Nandas had mastered the art of power but neglected the art of legitimacy. They proved that an empire could be built on wealth and discipline, but also that such an empire could collapse if it lost moral and social cohesion. The Mauryas learned this lesson well. Their success lay in tempering power with restraint, combining the material legacy of the Nandas with the moral ideals of Indian philosophy. In the broader sweep of history, the Nanda dynasty stands as both culmination and commencement, the culmination of centuries of political evolution from the Mahajanapadas, and the commencement of India's classical imperial tradition under the Mauryas. Their story illustrates the cyclical nature of power, how strength, unchecked by virtue, breeds decay, and how decay, in turn, gives rise to renewal. Centuries later, historians and poets would look back on the Nanda age not only as a cautionary tale, but as the dawn of something greater. The grandeur of the Mauryan Empire, the reign of Chandragupta, the statesmanship of Chanakya, and the moral vision of Ashoka was inseparable from the foundations the Nandas had laid. Their empire may have fallen, but their innovations endured, shaping the destiny of India long after their name had passed into legend. Thus, the story of the Nandas does not end in defeat. It ends in transformation. Their empire, born of ambition and discipline, paved the road for a new age of order and enlightenment. From their rise in Magadha to their fall at Pataliputra, the Nandas demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of absolute power. In their success and their downfall alike, they taught the enduring lesson that the strength of a state lies not only in its armies or wealth, but in the wisdom and justice with which it governs. The Mauryan dynasty, rising from their ashes, would carry that lesson forward, turning the Nanda dream of empire into a reality that would define the Indian subcontinent for generations to come.